He didn't whisper it. He didn't hide it. He walked into a room full of people who all knew his wife, and he placed his hand on another woman's back like Mara didn't exist. Like 13 years meant nothing. Like she was furniture he'd grown tired of. Mara stood 20 feet away, holding a champagne flute she hadn't touched, watching her husband introduce a stranger as the woman who understands the future he is building. Every guest in that ballroom went quiet. Not because they were shocked, because they were embarrassed for her. And then Adrian looked across the room, found her eyes, and smiled. That smile, that calm, deliberate, you won't do anything smile. That was the moment Mara Vale stopped being a wife and started being dangerous. If you have ever been made to feel invisible by someone you sacrificed everything for, stay with me. Because what Mara did next didn't involve screaming, crying, or confronting the other woman. It was quieter than that and so much more devastating. The night it finally ended had been building for years. That's the thing nobody tells you about a marriage collapsing. It doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in 100 small ones. In the way someone stops saying we and starts saying I. In the way gratitude curdles into expectation. In the way a man who once looked at you like you were the most capable person in the room starts looking through you like you are part of the wallpaper. Mara Ellison Vale had been watching it happen for at least 4 years, probably longer if she was honest with herself. And Mara was many things. Brilliant, patient, quietly formidable. But she was not always honest with herself about Adrian. That was her one real flaw, and she knew it. She had loved him too practically. She had made herself too useful. And somewhere along the way, love and utility had become so tangled together that she stopped knowing which one she was actually protecting. She was 36 years old, standing in the ballroom of the Husian estate, wearing a midnight blue dress she'd bought for herself, because nobody had thought to ask what she wanted to wear, surrounded by 60 people who smiled at her and felt sorry for her in equal measure. Her hair was up. Her posture was perfect. Her champagne was warm because she'd been holding it too long, moving from cluster to cluster of guests, playing the role she'd played for 13 years. The gracious wife, the quiet partner, the woman standing just slightly behind Adrian Vale. She was good at it. That was the honest truth. She had refined the performance until it was nearly invisible, which she understood now was exactly the problem. She had made erasure look elegant. The Husian ballroom was the kind of space designed to make ordinary people feel small and wealthy people feel powerful. Crystal chandeliers, parquet floors that had been polished to a mirror shine, round tables draped in ivory linen, each centered with arrangements of white peonies that cost more than most people made in a week. The Vale Foundation benefit was an annual tradition. A night when Boston's financial elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their generosity while drinking excellent wine and making deals that wouldn't appear on any agenda. Mara had organized the first 7 of these events personally, the invitations, the caterers, the seating arrangements calibrated to keep rivals separated and potential partners adjacent. She knew which board member couldn't be seated near open bars, which philanthropist's wife required a vegetarian option. The kitchen had been told about 3 times. She knew this room the way she knew everything connected to Adrian's world, completely invisibly and without any acknowledgement that the knowledge existed. This year, she had handed the logistics to a hired coordinator and simply shown up. That too had been a kind of signal. She just hadn't admitted it yet. She was mid-conversation with Margaret Holt, a silver-haired trustee of 2 medical foundations, who had known Adrian's family for decades when the ballroom doors opened. Margaret stopped talking. The conversations nearest the entrance began to falter, then die, rippling outward like something dropped into still water. Mara turned. Adrian walked in wearing a charcoal suit she didn't recognize, cut slim and expensive. The kind of suit a man buys when he is trying to look younger than he is. He was smiling that particular wide, easy smile he wore when he wanted a room to like him immediately. His hand was at the small of a woman's back, not hovering, resting, comfortable, proprietary. The woman was Sienna Cross. Mara knew who she was because she had heard the name twice in the past 3 months, and had chosen deliberately not to investigate further. Some part of her had understood that knowing more would require doing something. She hadn't been ready to do something. She was 32, striking in the particular way of women who have learned to use their appearance as architecture. Every element deliberate, nothing accidental. Her dress was the deep amber color of expensive cognac. Her smile, when she deployed it, was precisely warm enough to be disarming. Adrian guided her into the room like he was presenting something. "That's," Margaret began. "I know," Mara said. Her voice came out evenly. She was surprised by that. She had expected something to crack. Instead, she felt something older and quieter moving through her. The specific calm that arrives when a thing you have been dreading finally happens, and your body understands that the dread is over. The reality is always smaller than the fear, or sometimes it is larger, but at least it is real. Adrian saw her from across the room. He didn't look away. He didn't look guilty. He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, the duration of a conscious choice, and then turned back to Sienna and said something that made her laugh. That laugh. That was the detail that lodged itself somewhere in Mara's chest and stayed there. Not the entrance, not the hand on her back, the laugh. Because he had aimed it. He had made someone laugh loudly in a quiet room, specifically so his wife would hear it. Margaret put a hand briefly on Mara's arm. Said nothing. That said everything. The next 40 minutes were a performance Mara gave inside a performance, a Russian nesting doll of composure. She circulated. She spoke to an investment manager from Hartford who was boring but harmless. She accepted a replacement glass of champagne from a passing server. She answered questions about the foundation's education grants with a kind of specific, informed warmth that reminded people why they trusted her instinctively. She watched Adrian work the room with Sienna alongside him, not introduced as a business contact, not positioned as a colleague, but simply present in the way that carries its own explanation. She noticed which guests looked uncomfortable. She noticed which ones didn't. She noticed with a precision she would examine later that Charles Beaumont, a private equity partner who had been doing business with Vial Meridian for 6 years, made eye contact with her from across the room and then walked in the opposite direction. Charles Beaumont, who owed his position on 2 advisory boards partly to her recommendation. Charles, who she had sat next to at a dinner in February and who had told her over the sorbet that she was the only person at Vale who actually understood risk. Charles was choosing a side. He'd chosen it before the night was half over. That particular observation did something useful to Mara's anger. It organized it. She found herself near one of the tall windows overlooking the estate's rear garden, momentarily alone, and she allowed herself 30 seconds to simply be in the reality of what was happening, stop managing it, and just feel it. He brought her here. He knew I would be here. He did it anyway. Not by accident, not drunk, not in some moment of confused weakness. Adrian Vale had decided, gotten dressed, made a reservation, confirmed an arrival time, driven through Boston traffic, and walked into a room filled with people who knew his wife, their mutual world, the world they had built together with another woman on his arm, and no apparent shame about any of it. That required a specific kind of cruelty. Not hot cruelty, cold cruelty. The kind that has thought it through and concluded that the other person will absorb it. He had concluded that about her, and for years he had been right. That was the part she couldn't stop landing on. She had absorbed it. She had absorbed everything. She had been absorbing humiliations for so long that the capacity for it had become one of her defining qualities. Her endurance, her grace under pressure, her refusal to make scenes. Even the people who admired her most had actually been admiring her tolerance of a situation that should never have required tolerance. When she started confusing swallowing things with being strong, she didn't have an answer. But she felt the truth settle into her the way answers sometimes do, sideways through the back door, disguised as something else. She was still standing at the window when she felt a presence beside her and turned to find Adrian. Close. Too close. The way he got when he wanted to use his physical size as punctuation. Sienna was across the room. One of his board members had pulled her into a conversation. This was calculated, too. She recognized it. He had timed this. "You look like you are about to do something," he said quietly, pleasantly. the tone of a man who is certain he holds all the advantages. I am standing at a window, Mara said. You are standing at a window in a way that is making people uncomfortable. She looked at him. I wonder what could possibly be making people uncomfortable tonight. Something shifted in his expression, not guilt. Adrian Vale had not experienced guilt in any recognizable form for quite some time. What shifted was calculation. She saw him decide that pleasantness wasn't sufficient. Mara, he moved slightly, positioning himself between her and the room. His hand found her wrist beneath the level of the tablecloth they were standing near. Grip precise and firm. Not enough to cause pain, enough to communicate. Don't embarrass me. Smile. She looked down at his hand on her wrist. She had a sudden, vivid memory of their first year together. A camping trip in Vermont that had been his idea and her reluctant agreement. And how she'd fallen and twisted her ankle on a trail, and he had fashioned a makeshift support from his jacket and carried her pack the rest of the way down. And how she had thought, watching him do it, this is the kind of man who shows up. She had built so much on that memory. She had returned to it during difficult years as proof of who he fundamentally was. She wondered, looking at his hand on her wrist in a ballroom full of people who were pretending not to watch, when exactly that man had finished dying. She looked up, she met his eyes, and she smiled. Not the smile he was demanding. Something older. The expression of a woman arriving at a conclusion she should have reached years ago and feeling beneath the grief of it. The particular relief of finally being done. Her free hand moved to her right hand. She slid her wedding ring off. Came easily. She had lost weight recently. Stress weight, the kind your body sheds without asking permission. And she placed it on the tablecloth beside Adrian's champagne glass. The sound it made was almost nothing. A small, precise sound. His grip on her wrist loosened. Then let her build your future, Mara said. She turned and walked toward the ballroom doors at a pace that was unhurried and completely deliberate. Not fleeing, not storming out. Walking out the way you leave a room, when you have finished everything you came to do. Behind her, she heard the exact quality of silence that happens when 60 people simultaneously decide not to react. She didn't look back. She drove herself. That was important to her, that she drove herself. She had learned to drive late at 28, having spent most of her adult life in cities where it wasn't necessary. And she had always found something meditative about it. The focus required, the way the road demanded your attention and gave your thoughts permission to run alongside without pulling at you. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Boston that had been renovated from an old textile warehouse. She had signed the lease 11 days ago. She had told nobody, not even Tessa, until 3 days before the gala when she had called her closest friend and attorney and said only, "I need you to know that I have already started." Tessa had asked no questions. She had said, "Tell me what you need." And that had been the right answer, which was why Tessa had been the person Mara trusted with the thing she was about to ask. The apartment was modest. 1 bedroom, a desk she'd had delivered, a coffee maker, still in its box, because she hadn't gotten around to setting it up. A single photograph on the windowsill, her mother, June, standing outside the small bookstore she'd run in Worcester for 20 years, squinting into spring sun with the specific contentment of someone doing exactly what they were meant to do. Mara stood in the center of the apartment for a long time. No one needed anything from her. The silence had a texture she'd almost forgotten. It wasn't empty. It was full of her, just her. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She put her face in her hands not to cry, though she did cry briefly. The way you cry when something is both terrible and finished. And she let herself feel the full weight of 13 years at once. The early years, the good years, the years of slow erosion, the years of pretending she didn't see it happening, the years of being so much smaller than herself, that she had almost convinced herself this smaller version was who she actually was. Then she washed her face. She made herself a cup of tea on the gas range, because the coffee maker wasn't assembled yet. She sat at the desk with the notebook she'd bought specifically for this transition, a plain brown-covered thing. Nothing significant, just paper, and she wrote 1 sentence. "I still know exactly who I am." She underlined it. Then she went to sleep alone in a room that was entirely her own and slept better than she had in 3 years. At 6 in the morning, she picked up her phone. She found Tessa's name in her contacts. She typed 4 words and sent them before she could think around them. Start the separation process. Tessa's response came in 11 minutes. Already have the paperwork ready. Coffee this week? Mara smiled, set her phone down. Watched the early light come through the uncurtained windows and touch the bare walls of her new life. She did not feel brave. Brave implies facing something despite fear, and what Mara felt was something simpler and stranger. A specific sensation of having been afraid for so long that she'd forgotten she was doing it. And now the fear was gone, and the absence of it felt like standing up after being crouched for years. Her back straightened literally. She noticed it the way her shoulders dropped, the way her spine found itself. She had not realized how much of her own weight she had been holding in tension. Across the city in the master bedroom of the Vale estate in Brooklyn, Adrian woke up to an empty house and the beginning of understanding. His first phone call was to Miles Corbett, his CFO, at 7:45 in the morning. He expected Miles to manage him the way Miles always managed him, calmly, reassuringly, translating complexity into simple language that made Adrian feel like the smartest person handling the problem. What he got instead was 15 minutes of very careful language from a man who was clearly choosing his words with great precision. Miles confirmed what Adrian had been half aware of for years, without allowing himself to examine it directly. That several of Vale Meridian's most critical financial relationships were not at their foundation. Adrian's relationships, they were Mara's. 3 major lenders had extended favorable terms, not because of Vale Meridian's balance sheet, which had been genuinely precarious during several key periods, but because Mara Ellison Vale had personally guaranteed the debt. Her name on those agreements, her reputation, her credibility built over 15 years of doing exactly what she said she would do and never once defaulting on a commitment. 2 institutional investors responsible between them for capital that had funded 2 of Vale, Meridian's most significant acquisitions, had chosen to enter the relationship specifically because of Mara's involvement. One of them, a foundation based in Philadelphia, had a standing relationship with Mara that predated her marriage to Adrian by 4 years. "How long have you known this?" Adrian asked. Miles was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means someone is deciding how honest to be. "Long enough," he said. Finally, Adrian ended the call. He sat in his home office, in the chair he had imported from Denmark, in the house that represented the public image of his success. And he did what he rarely did. He tried to see the actual shape of the thing he had built. And for the first time, he looked at it without Mara standing in front of it. What he saw frightened him in a way that had nothing to do with money. He had made himself the story so completely that he had forgotten to notice who was holding up the structure behind it. He reached for his phone to call her. Then he stopped. He'd ordered her to smile. She had taken off her ring. He put the phone down. He stared at the wall. Outside his window, Boston was going about its morning. Traffic, a delivery truck, someone's dog. The world proceeding without reference to his private catastrophe. Indifferent and complete. He thought about the camping trip in Vermont. Her ankle, the way she'd laughed about it afterward at the bottom of the trail, leaning against his car, saying, "I told you I wasn't a hiking person." He thought about how much of what he'd built had been made possible by a woman he had brought himself to publicly humiliate in a room full of their shared acquaintances. He thought about her face when she put the ring down, not heartbroken, not furious, done. The word sat in him like a stone. He had managed many crises in his career. He had talked his way out of deals gone sideways, negotiated from weak positions, charmed skeptical lenders, recovered from genuine mistakes with enough confidence that recovery looked like strategy. But he could not charm Mara. He had tried that once, early in their trouble when she'd confront him about being left off press releases for a deal she had substantially constructed. He had bought her flowers and made her laugh, and redirected the conversations until she let it go. And she had let it go. And he had concluded wrongly that letting it go meant she didn't mind. He had made that mistake for 14 or 15 times since then. Each time she let it go. Each time he added another stone to a weight she was carrying. He had never bothered to ask how much she could carry. He was going to find out. The certified notice arrived at Vale Meridian's offices 11 days later. Formal, legal, specific. Mara was withdrawing her personal guarantees. All of them. A 30-day notice period is legally required. After 30 days, she was gone from the financial architecture of his company. Miles Corbett read it twice. Then he called the company's legal team. Then he called Adrian. Adrian read it standing at his office window 12 floors above downtown Boston watching the traffic below. The letter was 4 paragraphs. It was not angry. It was not punishing in its language. It was completely professional, which was somehow worse than if she had written it with rage, because rage would have meant she still needed something from him. This needed nothing from him. This was just an ending. He set the letter down and said to no one in the room, "Call an emergency board meeting." His assistant appeared in the doorway. "For when?" "For now," he said. "For as soon as we can get everyone there." She left. He stayed at the window. He sent flowers to the apartment on Mara's phone's last known address. He still had access to their shared location service. Had not thought to check it until that morning. The flowers were returned the following day. No note attached. He wrote a letter by hand. He hadn't written by hand in years. His handwriting looked like a stranger's. He read it back, and it sounded like a man trying to describe something he'd seen once from a distance. He sent it anyway. She didn't answer. He drove to Tessa's office on a Tuesday afternoon, without an appointment, which was exactly the kind of thing he did when he was used to the world accommodating him. Tessa's assistant told him Miss Rowe was unavailable. He sat in the waiting area for 23 minutes before Tessa appeared in the lobby and told him with the calm of a woman who had spent 3 weeks preparing for this conversation that she was not going to persuade Mara of anything. "She is my client," Tessa said. "But more than that, she is my friend, and I watched what happened to her for years. I am not a go-between, Adrian. I am not a translator. I am not going to relay messages. I just want to explain what's there to explain," Adrian said. Not unkindly, almost gently. The way you speak to someone you feel genuinely sorry for. You brought a woman to a foundation benefit. Your foundation, the event your wife built 7 times. You gripped her wrist in a room full of people and told her to smile. What is the explanation for that? He opened his mouth. "I am not asking," she said. "I am making a point. There isn't one. There's just what you did. And Mara's decision about what to do next isn't something you get input on." She turned and went back to her office. He drove home. He called his mother. Eleanor Vale picked up on the second ring, which meant she was expecting his call, which meant she already knew more than he thought she did. Eleanor always knew more than he thought she did. It was something he had spent 40 years being surprised by and never adapting to. "I assume this is about Mara," she said. "She is withdrawing from." "I know what she is doing, Adrian." Pause. The sound of her setting something down, a cup probably. Eleanor was always drinking tea. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think before you answer." He waited. "When was the last time you considered what it cost her?" Eleanor said, "Not what it cost you, what it cost her. The guarantees, the relationships, the years of being invisible. When did you last actually think about that?" He didn't answer. "That's what I thought." She said her voice wasn't harsh. It was worse than harsh. It was the voice of someone who had arrived at a conclusion about him long ago and was simply finally saying it out loud. "You confused being the face of the company," she said, "with being the reason it survived." The line went quiet. "She is not destroying you, Adrian. She's just stopped holding things up. And you are only now discovering that the ceiling and the floor were actually the same thing." He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office until 2 in the morning going through documents, financial records, deal histories, correspondence, looking for something that would let him tell himself a different story. He couldn't find one. Everywhere he looked inside Vale Meridian, he found Mara. Her initials on agreements, her name and correspondence from lenders, her handwriting and margins of documents he had signed without reading closely enough because she had already done the reading. Her calls, her presence, her credibility, holding things together that he had presented to the world as proof of his own genius. He had been the face, she had been the foundation. And he had spent years deciding the foundation should be grateful to the face for letting it go unnoticed. He put his head down on his desk. For the first time since the night of the gala, something moved in him that wasn't strategy or calculation or the impulse to fix the problem so he could recover from it. Something that felt like grief, not for Mara, not yet. He would get there eventually, but not yet. For himself, for the man he had told himself he was. For the story he had built so carefully, that had felt so solid and was made, he now understood almost entirely of her. Outside the window of his office, Boston was dark and still and going on without him. And somewhere across the city, in an apartment on the 4th floor of a converted warehouse, his wife was sleeping in a room with no photographs of him. And she was fine. And that more than anything else was the thing he could not stop thinking about. She was fine. He wasn't. And it was the first time in 13 years that those two facts had been in those particular positions. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning, but Miles Corbett arrived at 7:45 and sat alone in the conference room for over an hour before anyone else showed up. He wasn't reviewing documents. He had the documents memorized. He'd been living inside them for 11 days, ever since the certified notice arrived, turning the numbers over in his head the way you turn a stone over when you are not sure what's underneath it. But you're fairly certain it's something with too many legs. What Miles knew and had known in pieces for years was that Vale Meridian Holdings was not the company Adrian Vale presented to the world. It was not a disaster. It was not fraudulent. It was simply a company that had survived several near catastrophes through a combination of Adrian's genuine talent for vision and someone else's equally genuine talent for making sure the vision didn't collapse the floor it was standing on, that someone else had sent a 4-paragraph letter. Miles was 53 years old, had worked in corporate finance for 26 of those years, and had seen marriages intersect with business in every configuration imaginable. He had seen wives used as tax strategies. He had seen husbands hidden behind more capable spouses. He had seen family money weaponized, competence erased, credit stolen in ways so gradual the thief forgot they were stealing. What he had not often seen was the person being erased simply quietly stop. He heard footsteps in the hallway. 2 board members arrived together, talking in low voices that went lower when they saw him. He nodded. They nodded. Everyone in that room was about to have a conversation none of them had prepared adequately for, and they all knew it. By 5 minutes to 9, 8 people were seated around the table. 1 chair was empty. Adrian's. At 9:03, Adrian walked in. Miles had known Adrian Vale for 11 years. He had watched him walk into rooms on the worst days of the company's existence and perform confidence so well that nervous investors left feeling reassured. It was a genuine skill. Miles had respected it while also understanding privately that it was a skill being exercised in front of a backdrop Mara had painted. Today, the skill was not performing. Adrian looked like a man who had not slept and knew it showed and had decided to walk in anyway rather than postpone, which was at least a form of courage, even if it came from having no alternative. His suit was correct, his tie was straight, but his eyes had the particular quality of someone who has been conducting an internal argument for 72 hours and hasn't won it yet. He sat down. He looked at Miles. Miles opened the folder in front of him and said, 30 days. I know what 30 days means, Adrian said. I need you to know it specifically, Miles said, and his voice was careful and flat. The voice of a man who was not going to be managed today. Not in the general sense of this is a problem we need to address. I need you to understand that in 30 days, if nothing changes, we lose favorable terms on the Deering credit facility. The Harmon Group will have grounds to request a review of their participation structure and the Philadelphia Foundation's next disbursement round. He paused. Which we were counting on for the Riverside development is going to depend entirely on a relationship that no longer has any reason to continue. Silence around the table. A board member named Gerald Fitch, who was 70 years old and had been on 3 corporate boards before this one, and had the particular patience of someone who had outlasted multiple catastrophes, said quietly, "How long have we been operating with this exposure?" The guarantees have been in place in various forms. For Miles checked his notes, though he didn't need to, approximately 9 years. Some of the underlying relationships go back further. Gerald looked at Adrian. 9 years. I am not angry, Gerald said. I am asking a clarifying question. We have been carrying a material risk tied to one individual's personal involvement for 9 years, and this board was not formally informed of the nature of that dependency. The agreements were disclosed in footnotes, Gerald said, in footnotes of documents that ran 200 pages and were delivered 48 hours before votes. Don't, he said the last word quietly, without heat, but it landed. Adrian closed his mouth. The meeting went on for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Miles presented the exposure clearly without editorializing, because the numbers editorialized themselves. 2 other board members asked questions that were really statements with question marks attached. Third, the youngest, a woman named Petra Vance, who had joined the board 18 months ago, and whom Mara had initially recommended, said almost nothing, and wrote a great deal in the notebook in front of her, which Miles noticed and filed away. When the meeting broke up, Adrian asked Miles to stay. They sat across from each other in the emptied room. The morning had come fully through the windows, traffic noise from below. Someone's phone in the hallway ringing and being silenced. Tell me what I need to do, Adrian said. Miles looked at him for a moment. He had been waiting for this question and dreading it, because the answer was not what Adrian was prepared to hear. You need to talk to Mara, Miles said. I know she's not taking your calls. I am not saying call her. I am saying that the only path through this that doesn't end with the company in a genuinely dangerous position involves her. He leaned forward slightly. Adrian, she has not done anything wrong. She gave appropriate notice. She fulfilled every legal obligation. She is walking away cleanly because she has always done things cleanly, which is exactly why people trusted her. He paused. The same people who trusted her are now watching what you do next. Adrian was quiet. She is going to be at the board's emergency session on Monday, Miles said. She agreed to attend, on professional terms. How do you know that? Because I asked her, Miles said simply. I called her. She picked up. Something moved across Adrian's face. It wasn't anger exactly. It was the particular expression of a man discovering that the world has been having conversations without him and has found it managed perfectly well. She said she'd come because she cares about the employees. Miles continued. She specifically said that. Not the company, not you. The employees, the people who had nothing to do with how things ended up. Adrian nodded slowly. She's also, Miles said, choosing this next part carefully, 3 days into the process of withdrawing from the personal guarantee on the Mercer Street refinancing. Adrian went still. That one, Miles said. We hadn't even put in the disclosure footnotes. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Adrian said very quietly, Why not? Miles met his eyes. Because you signed the refinancing documents during the Aspen conference in March 2 years ago, and you didn't read them before you signed. And she had already added herself to the structure 2 weeks earlier, because she knew you would sign without reading, and she wanted the terms protected. He paused. She didn't tell you because you didn't ask. And you didn't ask because you had stopped being curious about how things worked once they were working. Adrian put both hands flat on the table. How many times? He asked. How many times what? How many times did she do that? Fix something before I knew it needed fixing. Miles was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'd need a few days to pull together a complete picture, but my preliminary count, and I want to be clear, this is preliminary, is somewhere between 11 and 14 significant interventions over 9 years. He paused, and those are only the ones that left paper trails I can find. Adrian stared at the table. Miles watched him. He felt something close to sympathy and something else close to exhaustion. He had liked Adrian Vale for years. He still liked him. In the abstract way you can like someone while understanding clearly that their relationship with reality has been selective and expensive for everyone around them. I need to ask you something, Miles said, and I need you to be honest. Adrian looked up. Did you know, Miles said, not the specifics. I understand you didn't track the specifics, but in the general sense, the feeling of it. Did you know that she was doing more than what you saw? Adrian held his gaze for several seconds. Yes, he said. Miles nodded. Did you know that what she was doing was what was holding certain things together? A longer pause. Yes, Adrian said again. Quieter. Miles nodded again. He closed the folder, stood up. Then Monday, he said, "You are going to sit in a room with your wife and your board and watch her lay out exactly what she protected and why it worked and what needs to happen going forward." He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. "And you are going to let her." He walked to the door. Then he stopped with his hand on the frame and said without turning around, "She could have made this ugly Adrian. She could have called every lender personally. She could have talked to the press. She has relationships in this city that go back 15 years. And she could have poisoned every single one of them against the company before you even knew it was happening." He paused. "She didn't. Think about what that says about her and what it says about what you did." He left. Adrian sat alone in the conference room for a long time. Outside the window, Boston went on being Boston, indifferent and complete. Eleanor Vale called Mara on a Wednesday evening, 10 days after the gala. Mara was sitting at her desk in the Cambridge apartment, eating reheated soup out of the pot. Because she hadn't bought enough bowls yet, and had not been sufficiently bothered by this to go purchase some. The life she was assembling for herself was, in practical terms, still quite sparse. She was finding she didn't mind. Every object in the apartment was something she had chosen, and there was a satisfaction in that simplicity that she hadn't expected. When Eleanor's name appeared on her phone screen, Mara looked at it for 4 rings before answering. Eleanor. Mara. A pause. The sound of evening somewhere in the background. Eleanor's house. Probably the one in Chestnut Hill that had been in the Vale family for 30 years. "I won't ask how you are. I imagine how you are is complicated. Getting less complicated," Mara said honestly. "Good." Another pause. "I am not calling for him. I didn't assume you were. I want to be sure." Eleanor's voice had the particular quality of a woman in her late 60s who had spent decades being the most pragmatic person in every room she entered. There was no warmth performance in it, just directness, which Mara had always respected. "I've been thinking about what I saw over the years. What I let happen, I suppose, is the accurate phrase." Mara set her spoon down. She had the feeling this was going to be a conversation that deserved her full attention. "You don't need to," she started. "I do," Eleanor said. "Not for him, for myself, and possibly for you if you'll allow it." She paused. "I watched my son take credit for your work for at least 6 years, probably longer. I saw him stop introducing you as his partner. I saw what the gala invitations looked like, how your name moved from equal billing to a footnote. I noticed. I am not a woman who doesn't notice things." Mara was quiet, and I said nothing. Eleanor continued. "Because the company was stable, because the family name was protected, because you were managing everything. And as long as you were managing everything, I allowed myself to believe that it wasn't as bad as it looked." "It was exactly as bad as it looked," Mara said. Not unkindly, just truthfully. "I know," a breath. "I want to apologize." Not with an explanation, just directly. Mara looked out the window. The city at night doing what cities do, indifferent to private reckoning, providing a backdrop for it. "I appreciate that," she said. "I also want to ask," Eleanor said, "what you are building." Mara paused. She hadn't spoken publicly about what she was thinking. The idea was still forming, still partly inside her notebook, and partly inside conversations she'd had with Tessa over coffee. But the outline of it had been there for a while. She realized longer than she'd acknowledged. "Something of my own," she said. "Good," Eleanor said. "Whatever it is, I'd like to know about it. Not to insert myself, just to know." "I'll tell you," Mara said when it's more than an outline. They said goodbye without the usual social formalities, which was actually warmer than most goodbyes Mara had exchanged over the past decade. And she sat for a while after in the lamplight with her cooling soup, thinking about what it meant to be seen by someone even imperfectly, even late after years of nearly perfect invisibility. It meant something. She was surprised by how much. Monday arrived the way difficult things tend to, too quickly and exactly as expected. Mara wore a suit she had bought the previous Thursday. Dark charcoal, well cut, nothing she had ever worn in her previous life, because she had spent years dressing in ways that Adrian's preference shaped without his ever stating it directly. This suit was entirely her own choice. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a moment before she left and looked at herself with the specific attention of someone taking inventory. She was not nervous. She had been nervous the night of the gala, in the way you're nervous before something you've been dreading. This was different. This was the morning after the dread ends and something functional takes over. She recognized the feeling from years of managing financial crisis on Adrian's behalf. The way once a thing became real and required action, all the feeling compressed itself into something useful. She walked into Vale Meridian's offices at 8:55. The receptionist, a young woman named Carmen, who had always liked Mara and had in the early years been one of the few people to address her by name rather than by relation, looked up and went briefly still. "Mrs. Vale," she said. "Just Mara." Carmen nodded quickly. "Of course, the conference room is." "I know where it is," Mara said gently and walked past. The conference room had 8 people in it. Miles standing near the windows, Gerald Fitch, and 2 other board members. Petra Vance with her notebook. The company's general counsel, a man named Robert Chu, who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, because he probably hadn't. And Adrian sitting at the far end of the table. And Adrian. She hadn't seen him since the ballroom. He looked like someone who had processed a significant amount of reality in a short period of time, and had not found the process comfortable. He looked. She thought more like himself than he had in years, the carefully constructed version stripped back to something raw and less managed. She did not feel satisfaction at this. She felt unexpectedly a complicated thing that she identified later, alone, as something adjacent to sorrow. Not for herself, for the man he might have been if something inside him had chosen differently earlier. She sat down. She did not sit near him. She took the seat that put her at the center of the table, equidistant from everyone, which was not accidental. She opened the folder she'd brought. She had prepared this material herself without help in 4 days. It was meticulous. "Thank you for coming," Miles said. "Thank you for asking," she said, and meant it simply without irony. She began. For 90 minutes, Mara Ellison Vale laid out the financial architecture of Vale Meridian with the precision of someone who had built much of it herself. She did not perform emotion. She did not editorialize. She did not look at Adrian with anything other than the professional directness she'd have shown a stranger. She explained each guarantee and its purpose, each relationship and its history, each moment of corporate exposure that had been quietly managed before it became a visible crisis. She explained the Deering facility, and why it had been structured the way it was, and why the specific language of the personal guarantee had been her suggestion, and not the lender's requirement. She explained the Philadelphia Foundation relationship going back to 2011, when she had known the Foundation's director through a professional network that had nothing to do with Adrian Vale. She laid it out without apology and without drama that the company had been substantially more dependent on her personal involvement than had ever been formally acknowledged. And then she put down her pen. "I am not presenting this as a grievance," she said. "I am presenting it as context. The board needs accurate context to make decisions going forward, and it didn't have it. That's a governance failure that needs to be corrected regardless of anything happening in my personal life, Nanolkaif." Gerald Fitch said, "What would you recommend?" "Independent financial oversight," she said. "A structured process for documenting all informal dependency relationships, guarantees, personal connections, relationships that exist because of a specific individual rather than the institution. Formal recognition of contributions in company records and a restructuring of executive authority that separates the public face of the company from operational decision-making." Petra Vance had been writing. She looked up. "Would you be willing to be involved in designing that restructuring in a professional consulting capacity?" Mara said, "Define scope, define timeline. Not as a returning employee and not in any capacity tied to my personal relationship with Adrian." Nobody looked at Adrian, which meant everyone was being careful not to look at Adrian, which meant everyone was aware of him, in the specific way you are aware of a person in a room who has done something that the room is politely not naming. Adrian had not said a word for 90 minutes. He sat at the end of the table with his hands folded and his expression controlled, but his jaw had a particular set to it that Mara recognized as the thing he did when he was holding himself at the edge of something. Then he said, "Can I speak?" It wasn't quite a question. Miles said, "Of course." Adrian looked at the table first. Then he looked up and he looked at no one in particular, which was its own kind of honesty. The look of someone not trying to perform for an audience, just trying to say something true. I knew, he said. I want to be clear about that. Not the specific details. I didn't track the specifics because I told myself tracking specifics was what I had people for. But I knew that Mara was carrying things I wasn't. He paused. I stopped acknowledging it because acknowledging it made me feel like I hadn't actually done what I told myself I'd done. And if I hadn't done it, then what exactly was I? He stopped. That's not an excuse. It's just what happened. The room was very quiet. In the gala, he said. I want to say this in front of people because saying it privately is not enough, I think. He paused again. I brought Sienna there deliberately. I knew Mara would be there. I knew what it would look like. I wanted it to look like that. Petra Vance's pen had stopped moving. I wanted to feel like I had outgrown something, Adrian said. Like the company was mine because I could afford to be careless about what it cost other people. He looked finally at Mara. That's what I did. Mara held his gaze. She was perfectly still. She did not speak. She did not need to. What she was feeling in that moment was not triumph. It was not forgiveness. It was something more complex and less resolved. The recognition that the truth finally spoken doesn't undo the years of it being unspoken, but it does change the shape of the room. I am glad you said that, she said finally. I mean that. I know you do, he said. That's the part I am still figuring out how to deserve. The board voted at the end of the meeting to begin restructuring. Mara signed a consulting agreement with Robert Chu that afternoon. Professional document, specific in scope, with a defined end date. She did not feel triumphant signing it. She felt like a woman who had built something real and was now being asked to account for it clearly, and was capable of doing that, and had always been capable of doing that, and was finally in a room where the capability was not being quietly absorbed and attributed to someone else. Walking out of the building, she paused at the lobby entrance. Carmen was at the desk pretending to organize papers she had clearly already organized. It went okay, Mara said. Carmen looked up. I am glad. Then quietly I always thought, a lot of us thought. I know, Mara said. Thank you. She pushed through the glass doors and walked out into the afternoon where the city was doing its regular autumn thing. Cold coming in off the harbor, the light going golden and thin, people moving fast on sidewalks, everyone carrying something toward somewhere. She had a meeting with Tessa at 4 o'clock. They were going to talk about the next phase of what Mara was building. She had a notebook full of names, women she had met through 15 years of networking, mostly while standing just behind Adrian at events. Women who had the ability and the vision and the drive, who had been standing in their own wrong rooms, waiting for a door that someone like Mara could open. She had about 2.5 hours. She pulled out her phone and looked at Tessa's last message, coffee or wine for this meeting. She typed back, wine, definitely wine. She was halfway down the block when her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She was tired and she had been answering phones all day. And some part of her wanted the 30-second piece of ignoring one. But she answered Miss Ellison. The voice was young, female, tightly controlled in the way of someone who is nervous and trying not to sound it. My name is Lena Hart. I am an investigative journalist. I work for the Commonwealth Business Review. A brief pause. I am calling because I've received some documentation about Vale Meridian Holdings that I believe you have relevant context for, and I wanted to reach you directly before I went any further. Mara stopped walking around her. The afternoon moved on. A cab, 2 men in hard hats, a woman with a stroller, the normal texture of a city that didn't know or care that the call she was standing in the middle of had just changed everything. What kind of documentation? Mara asked. Internal records. Lena Hart said, going back approximately 7 years. They show a pattern of, I want to be careful how I say this, a pattern of governance failure, specifically around the attribution of work and decision-making authority. Another pause, and they show fairly clearly who was actually responsible for preventing several significant financial crises. Mara was very still. Who gave you this? She asked. A brief hesitation. I can't tell you that yet. But I want you to know that whoever it was, they weren't trying to cause damage. They were trying to make sure that a true account existed somewhere. Mara looked up at the sky, which was doing that particular Boston October thing where it goes a shade of blue so clear it almost hurts to look at it. She had not asked for this. She had been careful specifically not to cause damage. She had structured her exit to be clean. She had walked away without calling a single journalist, without briefing a single rival, without using a single one of the weapons she could have picked up and aimed. And now someone else had picked up the weapons and was standing in her kitchen. "Give me your number," she said. Lena Hart gave it. "I'll call you back tomorrow morning," Mara said. "Don't publish anything until we've spoken, please." "I can give you until Friday," Lena said, not unkindly. "After Friday," Mara said, "I'll have spoken to you by Wednesday." She hung up. She stood on the sidewalk with her phone in her hand and her heart doing something she hadn't felt in 2 weeks. Not fear exactly, but that immediate focused aliveness that arrives when a situation stops being manageable and starts being real in a new way. Somebody inside Vale Meridian had decided that clean was no longer sufficient. Somebody had decided that the record needed to exist, and they were right. That was the thing she couldn't argue her way around. They were right. The record should exist. The truth of what had happened inside that company, the years of her name being absent from things she had built, that truth deserved to be somewhere other than a consulting agreement and a certified letter. But once it was public, she couldn't control what it cost. It would cost Adrian. It would cost people who had nothing to do with her marriage. Employees, lenders, partners. It could cost the very restructuring she had spent the last 3 weeks carefully engineering. She started walking again faster this time, toward Tessa's office. Tessa was going to say, "This is your choice, Mara. Whatever you decide, I'll support it." And Mara was going to have to decide whether the truth told publicly was an act of justice or an act of destruction, and whether after everything she could tell the difference from the inside. She pushed open the door to Tessa's building and stepped out of the October afternoon into the warmth of the lobby. And she knew with the cold certainty of someone who has been avoiding something long enough that it has finally arrived, that the careful, quiet exit she had planned was over. Tessa was already standing when Mara walked in, not sitting behind her desk the way she usually did, with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair and a half-finished cup of coffee going cold beside her keyboard. Standing by the window, which meant she had already heard something, or suspected something, or was the kind of person who absorbed disruption through the soles of her feet, and needed to be upright to process it. Mara closed the office door. "Lena Hart called me," Mara said. "Tessa turned when?" 20 minutes ago. Walking here." Tessa exhaled through her nose a short, controlled breath. That was her version of a reaction. What did she say? That she has internal documents. 7 years of records, governance failures, she called it. Attribution of work. Mara set her bag down on the chair by the door and stayed standing too, because sitting suddenly felt like the wrong posture for what they were about to do. She was careful. She was professional, but she has enough. Tessa moved away from the window and sat on the edge of her desk, arms crossed, not defensive, thinking. Someone inside the company gave it to her. Yes. Do you know who? She didn't say. She said they weren't trying to cause damage. Mara paused. She said they wanted a true account to exist somewhere. Tessa looked at her. Do you believe that? I believe that's true. And also that it doesn't matter whether it's true because the documents exist and Lena Hart has them. And she's going to publish by Friday regardless of anyone's intentions. The office was quiet for a moment. Outside the city made its sounds. Traffic on Mass Ave. Someone's car alarm in the distance. The ambient low hum of a place that doesn't pause for private crisis. Structuring, Tessa said, could be compromised. Mara said, if the article comes out before it's finished and the board reads it as exposure rather than progress, some of them may decide the cleanest exit is to cut ties entirely, which means the employees take the hit. And Adrian. Tessa uncrossed her arms. What do you want to do? Mara looked at her. This was one of the things she had always valued most about Tessa. The woman never told you what she thought you should want, she asked. She had been asking for 20 years since they were both 20-some women navigating rooms that had been built for other people. I want to talk to her, Mara said. Lena Hart, before she publishes anything. I want to understand what she has and what she is planning to do with it. And then I want to make a decision about whether to cooperate, about what kind of cooperation looks like something other than retaliation. Tessa nodded slowly. That's going to be a fine line. I know the moment your name is attached to this story, it stops being about corporate governance. Every outlet in Boston is going to run it as the marriage angle. The wife, the other woman, the empire. You know that. I know that. And you'll lose control of the framing the moment you open your mouth. Maybe, Mara said. Or maybe being the person who controls whether it's a story about destruction or a story about reform is exactly the kind of control I can actually exercise. She picked up her bag. I told her Wednesday I need tomorrow to think. Tessa walked her to the door. At the threshold, she put a hand briefly on Mara's arm, not performing comfort, just contact. The kind of thing you do for someone who is handling something very difficult, very competently, and you want them to know you see it. Wine is in the cabinet if you want to come back after, she said. Mara almost smiled. Hold it. She walked back out into the October evening alone. She didn't sleep well. That was honest. She had slept well most of the nights since leaving, better than she had in years, the bone-deep sleep of someone who has stopped bracing for things. But this night was not that. This night was the kind where her mind ran parallel tracks simultaneously and wouldn't let her choose just one. One track was practical. What Lena Hart likely had, what the board's response would be, what the timeline looked like. The other track was something older and more personal. The part of her that had spent 13 years learning to do the right thing, even when it was inconvenient, and was now being asked to define what the right thing was when it was genuinely ambiguous. She gave up on sleep at 5:30 and made coffee and sat at her desk with her notebook. She wrote, "What does the story need to be?" Then she sat with that for a long time. Not what do I want? Not what does Adrian deserve? What does the story need to be for the people it's going to reach? Particularly for the women who are going to be rid of a wife who spent 13 years holding up a company without a name on anything and who are going to recognize something in them because they have lived a version of it themselves. She wrote, not a revenge story, not a tragedy, something that shows what's possible after. She looked at it. Then she wrote underneath, but first, find out who opened this door, because that was the thing she kept circling to. Lena Hart had a source inside Vale Meridian. Someone with access to 7 years of records. Someone who had watched what happened and decided that silence was no longer acceptable. She needed to know who that was before she knew what it meant. She called Miles at 7:15 in the morning. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he was already awake and already working, which told her he might already know. Have you heard from a journalist named Lena Hart? She asked. Pause. 3 seconds. Long enough. Not directly, he said carefully. Miles, I heard she was making inquiries, he said. I didn't know she had documents. Who has access to internal records going back 7 years? Financial records, governance documents, anything that would show a pattern of how decisions were being attributed. Another pause. This one felt different, slower. Miles, she said again. There is a junior executive, he said. Corporate strategy. His name is Noah Mercer. He's been with the company 4 years. Miles stopped. He came to me about 8 months ago with concerns about governance, internal concerns. I told him we were working on improvements, and that he should document his concerns formally through the correct channel. And I thought he had, Miles said. I thought he'd written a memo, maybe escalated to Robert Chu. I didn't know he'd gone external. Mara set her coffee down. Was he wrong? She asked about the concerns. No, Miles said immediately. No, he wasn't wrong. Then he did what someone should have done, she said. Except he went to a journalist instead of a regulator, which means the story lands in a courtroom of public opinion before anyone has a chance to respond. She paused. I need to talk to him. Mara, he may not. I am not going to threaten him, Miles. I am going to listen to him. There's a difference. She picked up her coffee again. Can you give me his contact, or should I find another way? A short silence then. I'll send you his number. It came through in 2 minutes. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set her phone down and finished her coffee, standing at the window, watching the street below, where the morning was assembling itself, in the way mornings do slowly, then all at once. Noah Mercer agreed to meet her that afternoon. He chose a coffee shop in Jamaica Plain, which was either deliberate distance from downtown or just where he lived. He was there when she arrived, a young man who looked to be about 28, sitting with both hands wrapped around a mug, wearing the expression of someone who has done something they believe in and is not entirely sure they'll be able to defend it. She ordered a coffee at the counter and sat down across from him, without the preliminary social buffer most people deployed in uncomfortable situations. "You talked to Lena Hart," she said. He looked at her. His jaw was slightly set. He was prepared to defend himself, which told her that he'd been rehearsing this conversation and that whatever he'd been rehearsing had assumed she would come in at him directly. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He stopped, started again. "Because I watched it happen for 4 years, not just with you. The whole pattern, the way decisions got attributed, the way records were kept, the way the people who actually did the work." He stopped again. "I am not saying I am the hero of this. I know what I did was. What you did," she said, "was give a journalist the information to destroy a company's public, standing 3 weeks into a restructuring process that was specifically designed to address the exact problems you were documenting." He flinched. "Not much. Enough." "Did you know about the restructuring?" she asked. "I knew Miles had called a board meeting." "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," she said. The flinch again. "No." Mara looked at him. He was young and genuinely principled, and had made a decision that was both courageous and poorly timed, which was the specific combination that created the most damage because it was the hardest to argue against. He wasn't wrong. He was just expensive. "The article is going to come out," she said. "I understand that. I am not asking you to stop it." She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "I am asking you to understand what it is going to cost. The employees who had nothing to do with any of this governance failure, the smaller partners, the people on the Riverside development who have been waiting 18 months for financing that is now going to be called into question because of the timing." He was quiet. "I am also asking you to tell me," she said, "what you want the story to actually accomplish." He looked at her for a long moment, his hands tightened on his mug. "I wanted it to be true somewhere," he said. "That's all. I just wanted there to be a record of who actually—" He stopped. "Of what actually happened." Mara nodded. She reached into her bag and set a card on the table in front of him. Lena Hart's number, which she had transferred to a card before leaving her apartment, because she was the kind of person who did things like that. "Call her," she said. "Tell her you want to be present for a conversation I am going to have with her tomorrow morning. Tell her I'm prepared to cooperate with the story, but I have conditions about how it is framed." He looked at the card. "She is already going to publish." "She is going to publish something," Mara said. "The question is whether it's a story about a bad marriage and a company in crisis, or a story about a systemic problem that's already being addressed, and what's being built on the other side of it." She looked at him steadily. "That's a different article. It serves the truth better, and it actually helps the people you were trying to help." He picked up the card. She stood up. "One more thing," she said. "You are going to need to tell Miles you were the source before the article runs, not after. He deserves that." Noah looked like he wanted to argue this. Then he didn't. She left him sitting there with the card in his hand, and the expression of someone who has just discovered that moral courage and consequences are not actually separate things. She met Lena Hart at 8 o'clock Wednesday morning in a conference room at the Commonwealth Business Review's downtown office. Lena was 31, compact, with the kind of stillness that good journalists sometimes have. The quality of someone who is always in listening mode, always storing, always 3 questions ahead. Noah was there, sitting off to the side, looking like a man attending his own trial, who had agreed to the venue. Mara had brought Tessa. Lena had a recorder on the table. She gestured to it. "Do you object?" "No," Mara said. "I want to be clear about what I have," Lena said, and opened a folder. She was direct and organized, which Mara respected. She laid out the documents without dramatizing them. Board minutes, financial records, correspondence between Mara and lenders that was clearly initiated by Mara rather than Adrian. Emails where Adrian had taken credit for outcomes Mara had engineered. 7 years of it, methodical and irrefutable. Mara looked at each page. She already knew the content. Seeing it arranged by someone else, however, laid out with the detached clarity of a journalist's organization, did something she hadn't prepared for. It made the 13 years visible in a way they hadn't been when they were happening. When each incident was isolated, manageable, survivable, laid out sequentially, it looked like a system, not malice. Exactly, a system. The way a household slowly stops asking one person how they feel about anything, because that person has always managed to be fine, and the management is so reliable that it becomes structural. She thought, I let it become structural. Then, she thought, no, I managed it and they let me. There's a difference. She looked up from the folder. What's your lead? She asked Lena. Right now, Lena said, the lead is the exposure, the dependency the company has on a non-executive's personal guarantees and how that dependency was never formally disclosed. That's a financial story. Mara said it's also a governance story. It's also, Mara said, the kind of story that freezes institutional confidence for 6 months, while everyone waits to see if the company collapses, which is bad for a couple of hundred people who had nothing to do with any of this. Lena held her gaze. I understand the collateral impact, but I have a public interest obligation. I am not asking you not to publish, Mara said. I told Noah the same thing. I understand the story exists, and I understand why it should. She leaned forward slightly. I am asking you to consider a different frame, not less true, more complete. She paused. The governance failures are real. The pattern of attribution is real. But so is the restructuring that's already underway. So is the consulting agreement I signed last Monday. So is what I am building outside of Vale Meridian entirely. She paused again. The story of a woman who was erased from her own work for 13 years and then walked out and built something new, that's also public interest. That's also true, and it's more useful to the people who are going to read this everywhere, where the same thing is happening right now. Lena was quiet for a moment. Tessa said nothing. She had specifically agreed to say nothing in this meeting unless Mara asked for her, which was another reason Mara trusted her. What are your conditions? Lena asked. The restructuring gets covered, not just the failure, Mara said. Noah's role is handled with discretion. He raised legitimate concerns, and he should be protected from retaliation, not exposed unnecessarily. The employees are not characterized as victims of a collapsing company because the company is not collapsing. She paused. And I get to speak on the record about what I am building, not as a postscript, as a central element of the story. Lena looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Noah. Then she looked back at Mara. I'll need access to the board's restructuring documents. I'll provide what I am permitted to release under my consulting agreement. I'll need Adrian Vale to respond on the record. Mara didn't react. That's between you and him. Would you ask him to? A short silence. No, Mara said. But if you ask him yourself, I think he'll respond. She stopped, reconsidered. I think he understands now that the record matters. Lena wrote something in her notepad. Then she looked up. This is going to be a big story regardless of how it is framed. I know, Mara said. I am asking you to make it a true one. What happened over the next 72 hours was the particular chaos that results when a careful plan meets the real world and discovers the real world has not read the plan. Lena Hart called Adrian on Thursday morning. He called Mara on Thursday afternoon. She picked up because she had expected him to call and had decided on Wednesday night that not picking up was a form of avoidance she didn't want to practice anymore. She told me you spoke to her, he said. He sounded not angry. Something more fatigued than anger. She told me you wanted me to respond on the record. I said I thought you would, Mara said. I didn't ask her to ask you. But you didn't say I wouldn't. No. A pause. Why? She considered this. Because I think you have something real to say. And because the alternative is someone else telling your story without your voice in it. And because she stopped. Because I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to be the kind of person who lets people get destroyed by something I could have warned them about. He was quiet. Even me, he said. Even you, she said. That's not about you, Adrian. That's about who I am, he exhaled. What should I say? I can't tell you that, Mara. I can't tell you that, she said again steadily. This is the part you have to do yourself. Another long pause. There's something else, he said. His voice had changed. Gone slightly flatter, which was the thing his voice did when he was about to say something he'd been working up to. Lena Hart asked me about the Mercer Street refinancing. Mara went still. Specifically, he said, she asked about an addendum to the refinancing agreement filed in January 2 years ago. He paused. The addendum that transferred a 40% interest in underlying property as collateral. Mara set her coffee down. What about it? She has a copy of it, Adrian said. And the copy she has, it's different from the copy in our files. Mara's breath shortened, not visibly internally. The kind of thing that happens in your chest when your body understands something a half second before your mind does. Different how? She said. The signature line, Adrian said. On our copy, there's a witness signature from Robert Chu. Corporate counsel dated the same day as the agreement. He paused. On the copy she has, the witness line is blank. Mara stood up. She had been sitting at her desk, and she stood up because her body apparently needed to be vertical for this. That's not possible, she said. Robert was there. I was there. It was signed in his office. I know, Adrian said. That's what I told her. Where did she get her copy? She said it came with the other documents. The package Noah Mercer put together. The air in the room felt different. That was the only way she could describe it later. Like the temperature changed without the temperature actually changing. Noah doesn't have access to executed agreements, she said. He is corporate strategy. The legal files are in Robert Chu's office, Adrian said quietly. Yes. The word landed between them without either of them saying it. Mara said, Has anyone asked Robert? I called him this morning, Adrian said. He said he'd need to review the files before he could comment. A pause. He hasn't called back. She looked at the wall of her apartment. At the single photograph on the windowsill, her mother. Adrian, she said slowly. If the copy Lena Hart has shows a blank witness line and Robert's signature is on our copy, then either someone altered one of those documents or someone filed a version that was never fully executed. I know, he said. Either way, she said, it means the Mercer Street agreement may be unenforceable, he said. Or fraudulent. Yes, I know what it means. Mara sat back down, not because she wanted to sit, because her legs made the decision. The Mercer Street refinancing was not a peripheral agreement. It was the structural support for $47 million in debt across 3 separate entities. If the underlying collateral transfer was legally compromised, if the agreement had a defect that made it challengeable, then every entity in that chain had exposure, and every lender in that chain had grounds to call their positions. It wasn't just Vail Meridian. There were third-party investors, pension funds. She thought a municipal bond position connected to the Riverside development that had nothing to do with Adrian and everything to do with the people who lived in Riverside. She said, Has anyone called the lenders? Not yet. Adrian, she said his name with a precision that was neither warm nor cold. You have to call the lenders today before the article runs. Before they read about this in print. You have to get ahead of this. If I call the lenders today, they're going to find out anyway, he said. The question is whether they find out from you or from a newspaper, she said. One of those is a crisis. The other is a catastrophe. Silence. And Robert Chu, she said, you need someone from outside the company looking at those documents. Not Robert, not your regular legal team. Someone independent who has no connection to the agreement. He stopped. She heard him rubbing his face, a sound a bit specific and human and tired. That's going to cost us 3 days minimum. Then it costs us 3 days, she said. Do it. A long pause. Mara, his voice had dropped, not strategic now, just exhausted. The voice of a man at the edge of something. If Robert. He didn't finish the sentence. She knew what he wasn't finishing. If Robert Chu, who had been the company's general counsel for 8 years, who had sat in on every significant agreement, who had been the person Adrian relied on to make sure the paperwork was right, if Robert had altered a document or filed an unexecuted version or done anything to compromise the legal foundation of that agreement, then what they were dealing with was not a governance failure. It was fraud, and the implications of that radiated outward from Vail Meridian in every direction, touching every party, every lender, every municipality, every pension fund connected to the chain, including Mara. Her name was on documents adjacent to that agreement. Not on the agreement itself, but adjacent. Her guarantee structure touched entities that touched the Mercer Street refinancing. If the agreement was fraudulent, the question of what she had known, And when she had known, it was going to be asked by journalists, by regulators, by lawyers whose job it would be to find someone responsible and make sure that someone had a name attached. She had walked away from Adrian's company clean. She might not be able to stay clean. Get the independent review, she said. Her voice was steady. She was grateful for that. And call your lenders. Today. She hung up. She sat in the sudden quiet of her apartment, with her heart doing something she hadn't felt since the night she walked out of the ballroom. Not the collected calm of a decision being made, but the raw, disorienting sensation of realizing that the floor you thought was solid has a crack in it that you didn't put there and may not be able to fix. She picked up her phone and called Tessa. "I need you to come here," she said when Tessa answered, "and bring whatever you would bring if you thought we might need to spend the night figuring something out." Short pause. That bad? Mara looked at the photograph of her mother. Her mother, who had run a bookstore for 20 years, on nothing but principle and genuine love for what she did, who had never once asked Mara to be anything other than exactly herself. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's what's bad." She hung up and stared at the wall and tried to calculate how many pieces were moving simultaneously and found that she couldn't. Because for the first time since she had placed her wedding ring beside a champagne glass and walked through a ballroom door, Mara Ellison Vale did not know what was going to happen next. And the not knowing was not the liberating, clean uncertainty of someone building something new, but the cold, vertiginous uncertainty of someone who has discovered that the fire she thought was behind her may have been running alongside her the whole time. Tessa arrived 40 minutes later with a bottle of wine she didn't open and a legal pad she immediately did. She sat at the kitchen table across from Mara and listened without interrupting while Mara laid out everything Adrian had said. She had the quality in moments like this of someone who could absorb information at high speed without any of it leaking out of her expression. When Mara finished, Tessa was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "Tell me exactly what your name is on." "My personal guarantees touch 3 entities," Mara said. She had already pulled up the documents on her laptop. 2 of them have no direct connection to the Mercer Street refinancing. The third, the Huon Bridge Fund, holds a secondary position in an entity that holds a participating interest in the Mercer Street underlying property. How secondary? 2 levels removed. That's still connected, I know. Tessa wrote on the legal pad, "And your guarantee on the Huon Bridge position. When does that expire?" 14 days from now, Mara said, under the withdrawal notice I filed. "So you are currently still on the hook for 14 days. Yes. Tessa set her pen down flat on the table. "Mara, if the Mercer Street agreement has a document defect and someone challenges the collateral transfer, the entities downstream from that agreement are going to be fighting over who absorbs the shortfall. And one of those entities has your personal guarantee on it for the next 2 weeks. I know what it means." "Do you know what it means in dollar terms?" Mara looked at her. "Worst case, between $3 and $7 million, depending on how the loss gets allocated." Tessa picked her pen back up. "Okay." She said it the way someone says okay when they mean this is survivable. "Let's figure out how. Who did the independent document review?" "Adrian is arranging it. He said tonight. We need our own review separate from his, completely independent." She was already writing a name. David Ferris. He does forensic document analysis. He's done work for us before, and he's fast, and he doesn't talk to people he shouldn't. She tore the top sheet off and pushed it across to Mara. "Call him in the morning first thing. Get him both versions of the document, yours and the one Lena Hart has. Tell him we need a preliminary assessment within 48 hours. Mara took the paper. "And if his assessment matches what I think it's going to say, then we go to the regulators ourselves," Tessa said. "Before anyone else does, before the article, before Adrian's lenders start making calls." She paused. "Self-reporting is the only thing that separates cooperation from complicity. And you need to be clearly in the cooperation column, even if I had nothing to do with it. Especially then," Tessa said, "because if you had nothing to do with it and you wait, it looks like you did." Mara stared at the table, the grain of the wood, a coffee ring she hadn't wiped up from this morning. The ordinary texture of a life that was supposed to be quieter than this. "Robert Chu," she said. Yeah, Tessa said. He was careful. He was always careful. He was the person Adrian deferred to on anything legal because Robert was meticulous. He read everything. He flagged everything. She paused. He was the one person in that company I trusted to know where the edges were. People change, Tessa said. Not coldly, just factually. Or they were always something you didn't see clearly enough, Mara said. Neither of them answered that. They worked until midnight. Tessa opened the wine at 10 o'clock, and they drank it slowly while going through documents. The way you do when the work is hard enough that you need something in your hands that isn't a pen. By the time Tessa left, they had a list of 7 action items, in order of priority, and a timeline that assumed everything would go wrong and planned around that assumption. Mara stood at the window after she heard the elevator close. 14 days. She had 14 days of exposure on the Hoosian Bridge guarantee. 14 days in which the Mercer Street situation could either resolve cleanly or blow open into something that reached her. She had walked out of her marriage to be free of exactly this kind of exposure, the kind that comes from being structurally connected to someone else's decisions. She was still connected. For 14 more days, she was still connected. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Below, a cab moved through an intersection. A man walked a dog, the night doing its regular indifferent business. 14 days, she said aloud to nobody. Then she went to bed because there was nothing else she could do before morning, and being undone by the waiting was a luxury she couldn't afford. Thursday arrived like a fist. At 7:43, Adrian called. Robert Chu resigned this morning, he said, effective immediately. He submitted a written resignation to my personal email at 6:15, and his office key was left at the front desk. Mara sat on the edge of her bed. Did he say anything in the resignation? That he was resigning for personal reasons and wished the company well. A pause. That's it. 5 sentences. He's lawyered up. She said, That's what I think, Adrian. She stood, walked to the window, because standing still wasn't working. A general counsel who resigns without notice the morning after you called to ask about a document discrepancy is not a person who made an innocent mistake. I know that. Did you call the lenders last night? Called 2 of them. The third, the pension fund administrator, I couldn't reach after 5. I left a message. Call them again now before 9. She checked the time, 7:46. You have about an hour before the business day starts in full and people start reading their emails. The pension fund, Adrian said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not fear exactly. Adrian Vale was not a man built for fear. Something adjacent to it. The specific tone of someone confronting consequences they can no longer manage around. They have $42 million in exposure tied to this chain. I know. If they move to protect their position, then the other lenders will read it as a signal and move too, she said. Yes. Which is why you have to get to them first and frame this as a proactive disclosure, not a crisis. She pressed her palm against the cold window glass. You have to be the person who called them, Adrian, not the person they heard about from someone else. He was quiet for a moment. Will you be on the call? She hadn't expected that. She stood with her hand on the glass and felt the particular weight of the question, the way it carried everything it wasn't saying. He wasn't asking her to save him. He had asked her to be present. There was a difference, and she recognized it. No, she said, you need to do this yourself. But I'll be available after if you need to talk through what they say. A long pause. Okay, he said and hung up. She called David Ferris at 8 sharp. By 10 o'clock Thursday morning, the Vale Meridian legal situation had become something that required its own room. Miles Corbett had called an emergency session with the remaining legal team. Outside counsel from a firm in New York who had worked with the company on the Riverside development and had no connection to Robert Chu's previous work. They were on a conference call by 9:45. Mara was not on the call. She knew about it because Miles texted her at 10:12. Outside counsel engaged. They are going through the Mercer Street file now. We'll know more by this afternoon. She was at her desk in the Cambridge apartment, working through her own documentation with Tessa on speakerphone when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She answered it because she had learned this week that not answering unfamiliar numbers was a form of denial she couldn't practice anymore. Miss Ellison, A man's voice. Professional. Clipped. My name is Daniel Reeves. I am a partner at Reeves & Cortland. I've been retained to represent Robert Chu in connection with a matter involving Vale Meridian Holdings. A pause. I'd like to request a brief conversation at your convenience. Mara set her pen down. Mr. Reeves, she said, I have my own counsel. Any communication should go through her. Of course, I understand. I simply wanted to reach out personally because... He paused in a way that sounded rehearsed. My client believes that you may have information that could help clarify certain aspects of the Mercer Street Agreement, and he would like the opportunity to speak with you before the situation becomes more public. The word public sat in the air for a moment. Mara looked at Tessa's name on her speakerphone screen. She knew Tessa was listening. Mr. Reeves, she said, give me your number and my attorney will be in touch. She hung up. Tell me you heard that, she said to Tessa. I heard it, Tessa said. He is fishing. Robert wants to know what you know before he decides what to say. What does he think I know? That, Tessa said, is the question. Mara stood up and walked to the kitchen and stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists because her hands felt hot and she needed something physical to do that was not screaming. She had managed crisis for 13 years. She had talked lenders off ledges and restructured failing deals at midnight and absorbed years of professional diminishment without losing her composure. She was good at the pressure. She had built tolerance for it that most people never develop because most people never have to. But this was different. This was the first crisis that was entirely someone else's thinking and that threatened to take down something she had not built with Adrian, but was trying to build for herself. The Ellison Network was still in its early form, not yet formally incorporated, not yet funded beyond what she had contributed herself, existing mostly in notebooks and conversations, and the gathered momentum of relationships she'd spent 15 years developing. If her name became attached to a fraud investigation, even tangentially, even as a witness, even as someone cleared after the fact, the institutional relationship she was counting on would get careful. Careful meant slow. Slow at this stage meant the network stalled before it had enough mass to survive the pause. She turned off the water, dried her hands, walked back to the desk. I need to know what Robert did, she said. We'll know more when Ferris. Today, Mara said, I need to know today. Tessa was quiet for a moment. I'll call him. Push for a preliminary read by 3. David Ferris called at 2:47. He was 61, a former forensic accountant turned document specialist, a man of extremely few words who charged accordingly and was worth it. He had reviewed both versions of the Mercer Street addendum, the one from Vale Meridian's files and the one Lena Hart possessed, and his preliminary assessment took approximately 45 seconds to deliver. The document Lena Hart has is an earlier draft, he said. It predates the executed version by approximately 3 weeks based on the metadata I can extract from the digital version. The witness line was blank in the draft. It was blank. That's normal. Drafts often circulate without witness signatures. He paused. The executed version in Vale Meridian's files appears genuine. Chu's signature. The notarization. The dating all consistent with an agreement signed when the records indicate it was signed. Mara closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. So there's no document fraud. Not that I can find in these 2 documents, Ferris said. Now that's not the same as saying nothing is wrong. He paused again. The particular pause of someone who has found one thing and noticed something else nearby. The collateral transfer itself, the underlying property interest that was transferred as security. I'd want another set of eyes on the valuation. The assessed value used in the agreement is $43 million. Current comparable transactions I can pull in about 15 minutes suggest the actual market value at the time was closer to 31 or 32. Mara's hand tightened on the phone. Are you telling me the collateral was overvalued? She said, I am telling you the number in the agreement doesn't match the market at the time. He said, whether that's fraud or a bad appraisal or an aggressive negotiating position, I can't tell you in 48 hours. That's a longer investigation. He paused. But Miss Ellison, the lender on that agreement accepted the collateral at $43 million. If the true value was 31, they were under-collateralized by about $12 million from day one. She did the math in her head without meaning to. Fast, automatic, the way she had always done math, a reflex she'd developed so young it felt like breathing. If the lender challenged the valuation and the collateral position was restated at market value, the downstream entities in the chain, including the Husian Bridge Fund, lost their protection margin. The guarantee holders became the buffer, which meant she became the buffer for 14 more days. "Send me your written assessment," she said. "Today, please." "You'll have it by 5, he said, and hung up. She sat very still. Then she called Tessa and relayed everything, and there was a silence on the line that was longer than Tessa's silences usually were. "Valuation," Tessa said finally. "Who ordered the appraisal?" Mara thought back. She had not been involved in the Mercer Street refinancing at the document level. She had been brought in to facilitate the lender relationship, to sit in the room and provide the credibility that got the terms agreed. And then Robert Chu had handled the execution. She had signed her guarantee addendum based on the terms she'd been told. She had not independently verified the appraisal. She had trusted Robert. That was the thing sitting in her chest right now like a coal. The understanding that the one person in the entire Vale Meridian structure she had not felt she needed to double-check had been possibly the one person she most needed to. "I don't know," she said. "I need to find out." "Don't call anyone at the company," Tessa said immediately. "Not Miles, not outside counsel. Let me handle this. If there's a valuation issue and they're already doing their own investigation, we need to be parallel to them, not inside their process." "Okay, Mara." Tessa's voice shifted slightly, the tone of a friend and not a lawyer, which happened sometimes and was always unmistakable. "You didn't do this. I know. I need you to actually know that, not just say it." Mara looked at the photograph of her mother. "I trusted someone I shouldn't have trusted completely. That's something I did." "That's called being human," Tessa said. "It's not the same thing." Friday morning, the article ran. Mara read it at 6:15 on her laptop, sitting at her desk with her first coffee, still in the clothes she'd slept in, because she hadn't actually slept so much as horizontally worried for 6 hours. Lena Hart had written it the way she had asked, not as a revenge story, not as a marriage expose, not as a corporate collapse narrative. It was a governance story. The headline was measured: "The Invisible Architect, Governance Failures at Vale Meridian, and the Woman Who Kept the Company Alive." The frame was exactly what Mara had requested: the system, not the individual, the failure, but also the response, the restructuring, the consulting agreement. And at the center of it, as a primary source and not an afterthought, Mara herself. Lena had quoted her carefully. "The problem isn't Adrian Vale. The problem is a structure that made his kind of oversight invisible and my kind of contribution deniable. That structure exists everywhere. We need to name it everywhere. It was good. It was honest. It was the article Mara had asked for, and Lena had delivered, and she felt reading it something close to gratitude for that." Then she got to the final section. Lena had included in the last 4 paragraphs a note about the ongoing review of certain Vale Meridian financial agreements, citing sources familiar with the matter. She had not named the Mercer Street refinancing specifically. She had not named Robert Chu. But she had noted that the company's outside counsel was conducting a review of select documentation from the past 2 years, and that the results were expected within the week. It was careful. It was responsible. It was also a live wire dropped into a room full of people who were now going to spend the weekend pulling on threads. Mara's phone started ringing at 6:43. The first call was from Miles. She let it go to voicemail. The second was from Gerald Fitch. She answered that one. "I've read the article," he said. "I assume the board needs to meet today." "I know. Can you be there?" She looked at the time. 6:51. "What time?" 10 o'clock. "I'll be there," she said. She showered, dressed, and was out the door by 7:45. On the sidewalk, her phone rang again. A number she recognized this time. One that stopped her mid-stride on the Cambridge morning pavement with commuters moving around her like water around a stone. "Eleanor Vale," she answered. "I read it," Eleanor said. No preamble. "It's good. I thought so. The board meetings. I know about it. I am going." "There's something you should know before you walk in," Eleanor said, and her voice had changed. That specific tightening that happens when someone is about to say something they have been carrying for a while and have decided they can no longer carry alone. About the Mercer Street appraisal, Mara stopped walking entirely. A man behind her muttered something and moved around her. She stepped to the side against a building wall out of the pedestrian current. "Tell me," she said. "The appraisal was commissioned by Robert Chu," Eleanor said, "in April of that year. The firm he used, I recognized the name when I saw it in the files Adrian showed me last night. It's a firm that did an appraisal for a private property transaction of mine in 2019. She paused. The property was a small commercial building in Brooklyn. They valued it at $2.3 million. I sold it 14 months later for 1.6. Mara's hand tightened on the phone. "Eleanor," she said carefully, "are you telling me you think the firm has a pattern of inflating valuations?" "I am telling you that when I saw the name, I made some calls this morning," Eleanor said. "Before 6 o'clock. I have friends who have been in real estate in this city for 40 years, Mara called them. A pause. "The firm did 5 appraisals in the Boston metro area in that calendar year. Of the 5, 3 have since been called into question in unrelated transactions. The firm closed in 2022. The principal, a man named Garrett, is currently the subject of a civil suit in Connecticut." The morning traffic moved past. Someone's coffee smell drifted by. The completely ordinary texture of a city that had no idea. "Why are you telling me this?" Mara asked, not with suspicion, with genuine curiosity. "Why not to take this directly to Adrian or the board?" A short silence. "Because," Eleanor said, "I have known for 3 days that this is connected to something that could damage you. And I have already once in my life stayed quiet about something that damaged you because the damage was convenient for my family." Her voice was steady, but cost something to keep steady. Mara could hear the cost of it. "I am done doing that." Mara pressed her back against the building wall and looked up at the strip of sky visible between the buildings. Gray-blue, cold, perfectly clear. "Send me what you have," she said. "Everything. Names, dates, whatever your contacts gave you." "Already sending," Eleanor said. "I typed it up at 5:30 this morning." She hung up. Mara stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then she started walking fast now, because the board meeting was at 10 o'clock, and she had 2 hours, and she needed every minute of them. She called Tessa while walking. "Eleanor Vale just gave me the thread," she said when Tessa picked up. "The appraisal firm, there's a pattern. Other properties, other inflations. The principal is already in civil litigation in Connecticut." Tessa's keyboard started clicking immediately. "Send me everything." "Coming in about 30 seconds. "Tessa," she stepped around a couple, walking too slowly. "If Robert Chu used a firm with a documented pattern of inflated valuations, and the lender accepted a collateral value that was $12 million above market, then the question is whether Robert knew the firm was problematic," Tessa said, "and whether he chose them because of it, which would make it fraud." "Yes. And I sat in that room," Mara said. "I facilitated that lender relationship. I introduced the parties. I provided the credibility that got them to the table. You did not appoint the appraiser." Tessa said no, but I didn't ask who did. Tessa stopped typing. "Mara, stop. You need to stop going to the place where this is your fault. You were used. Robert used your credibility to close an agreement that may have been fraudulent, which means he needed me there precisely because I was trustworthy," Mara said. "Which means my integrity was the packaging for something rotten." She said it flatly without drama because that was what it was. "That's what I need to walk into a board meeting and say out loud in 2 hours." The silence on the line was short. "Then we better move fast," Tessa said. The boardroom at 10 o'clock had a different quality than the one on Monday. Monday had been tense. This was something past tense. The atmosphere of people who have read the news and slept badly, and arrived with the specific alertness of individuals who know the next few hours are going to determine something important. All 8 board members were present. Miles was there looking like he had aged a week in 48 hours. Outside counsel, 2 attorneys from the New York firm. A man and a woman who had the burnished, expensive composure of people who had been in difficult rooms before sat to one side with laptops open. Adrian was at the head of the table. He looked at Mara when she came in. She looked back. Something passed between them. Not warmth, not coldness. The specific acknowledgement of two people who have known each other for 13 years and are standing in the most consequential room of that knowledge. She sat down. She opened her folder. Before we start, she said, "I need to share some information that came to me this morning." Gerald Fitch said, "Go ahead." She laid it out. The appraisal firm Eleanor's contacts, the pattern of inflated valuations, the civil suit in Connecticut, the timeline of how the firm had been selected and by whom. She was precise, and she was fast because they didn't have time for anything else. She put Eleanor's typed summary in the center of the table and watched the outside counsel pick it up simultaneously. The female attorney, her name was Sandra Park. She had introduced herself in the lobby, looked up from the summary and said, "How did you get this?" "Eleanor Vale," Mara said, Adrian's mother. She recognized the appraisal firm's name from a personal transaction and made calls this morning. Sandra Park looked at Adrian. "Did you know your mother was doing this?" "No," he said. Sandra Park looked back at Mara. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite respect, but the professional acknowledgement that the person across from her was competent in a way that changed the shape of the problem. "What this is consistent with what we found in our overnight review," she said carefully. "We had flagged the appraisal as an area requiring further examination. Your information accelerates that examination significantly. Is there fraud?" Mara asked directly. Sandra Park glanced at her colleague. "We believe Robert Chu selected the appraisal firm with knowledge of its history," she said. "We are not yet able to determine whether he did so in coordination with anyone else or for personal financial benefit. That will take longer." "What's the exposure?" Miles asked, to the company. Sandra Park set the summary down. "If the collateral is restated at market value, the Mercer Street lending chain is under-collateralized by approximately $11 to $13 million. The lenders will have grounds to call their positions. We recommend moving to restructure the debt voluntarily before they exercise that right." "Pension fund," Gerald Fitch said. "The pension fund is our first call this morning," Sandra said. "They need to hear from the company directly today." "What about Miss Ellison's exposure?" Tessa asked from beside Mara. Sandra Park looked at Mara. "Based on the structure of the guarantees and the nature of Miss Ellison's involvement, facilitating the lender relationship rather than executing the agreement or selecting the appraiser, we believe her position is defensible. She was not a party to the document execution. She did not commission the appraisal. She did not benefit from the inflated valuation." She paused. "We would, however, recommend that she formally distance herself from the Hoosian Bridge guarantee immediately, rather than waiting for the 14-day notice period to expire." "I am prepared to do that," Mara said. "Today," Tessa said. Today, Sandra confirmed. Mara reached into her folder and put a pre-prepared letter on the table. She had written it at 5 in the morning, which was either foresight or insomnia. She wasn't sure it mattered which. "I had my attorney draft it last night," she said. "It waives the notice period and removes my guarantee effective immediately. I just need Robert Chu's counter-signature on behalf of the company." Robert Chu was no longer counsel. "Robert is gone," Adrian said. "A beat. Then whoever is acting general counsel," Mara said and looked at Sandra Park. "We can execute it," Sandra said. Mara signed the letter. Tessa witnessed it. Sandra Park took it. And in that moment, the moment the pen came away from the paper, Mara felt something release in her chest that had been wound tight since Thursday afternoon. Not everything. Not the uncertainty about what was coming, but the immediate specific exposure, her money, her name attached to the bottom of someone else's fraud. That left. She breathed. Then Adrian said, "Want to address the board." The room shifted attention to him. He stood. He didn't usually stand for internal meetings. It was the kind of theater he reserved for presentations to outside parties. Standing here now felt like something different. Like a man who needed the physical commitment of being upright for what he was about to say. "I have spent the last 10 days," he said, "discovering the real structure of a company I told myself I'd built." He wasn't reading from anything. His hands were at his sides. "I want to be direct with this board about something that the article this morning addresses but doesn't fully state." He paused. "I knew that Mara's involvement was critical to the company's financial stability. I knew it, and I actively chose not to formalize it, not to acknowledge it in records, not to ensure that her contributions were visible. I made that choice because formalizing it would have required me to acknowledge that the company was not purely mine, and I was not willing to do that. Another pause. That choice, my choice, created the governance structure that Robert Chu was able to exploit. He used the same informality, the same absence of oversight that I used to erase Mara's contributions. He used it for something much worse. But the conditions that made it possible, I made those conditions. The room was absolutely still. I am not saying this to reduce my liability, he said. I understand I have legal exposure from the governance failures identified in our review. I am saying it because this board needs to understand the actual chain of causation if you are going to make real changes, and because. He stopped. He looked at Mara briefly with the expression of a man who has made peace with not being forgiven and is saying what needs to be said anyway, because she deserves to have it said in this room on the record by me. Mara did not look away. She held his gaze and felt the complicated thing that had no clean name. Not forgiveness, not absolution, not the erasure of 13 years. Something closer to the end of a particular kind of loneliness, the loneliness of being the only person who knew the full truth of something. Someone else knew it now. He had said it out loud where it could be documented. That mattered. She hadn't known how much it would matter until it happened. Gerald Fitch said, "The board will take a short recess." People stood, conversations in low voices. Sandra Park moved to the corner with her colleague and her phone. Miles came to stand beside Mara. "You okay?" he said quietly. "Yes," she said, and it was true enough. At the window, Adrian stood alone looking out at Boston, his city, his company, his name on the building, all of it, suddenly with visible cracks in it. Not the kind that meant collapse, but the kind that meant it was real. A real thing rather than a performance of a thing, because real things have cracks, and only performances are seamless. He turned and found her looking at him. She crossed the room because the distance felt wrong given everything they had just put into the air. She stopped a few feet away. "The statement you just gave," she said. "That took something. Not as much as it should have," he said. "I should have said it years ago." "Yes," she said simply. "You should have." He nodded. His jaw worked slightly. "What happens now?" "Now the board restructures," she said. "Outside counsel manages the fraud investigation. The lenders get called. The pension fund gets protected as much as possible." She paused. "And the company survives differently than it was, but it survives." "And you?" She looked at him. "I walk out of this building and I build the thing I am supposed to build." She paused. "This?" She gestured briefly, meaning the room, the crisis, all of it. "This is the last time I fix something of yours, Adrian. After today, my consulting agreement ends and your company is yours, completely yours. Whatever it is, without me holding parts of it up, that's what you get to find out." His expression didn't crumble. He wasn't a man who crumbled, but something went out of it, some last remaining hope he'd been maintaining against evidence. The specific hope that this might still resolve into a version where they found their way back together, where the crisis became the thing that rebuilt what had eroded. She watched it go. She felt something she recognized distantly as grief for the version of them that had existed early. The couple in Vermont, on a trail, her ankle wrapped in his jacket. Both of them still capable of being exactly what they needed to be for each other. That version was long gone, and had been long gone. And grieving it now was not weakness. It was just honest. "I believe you are becoming who you should have been," she said. "I mean that." "I know," he said. "That doesn't give me back 13 years, she said. "I know that too." The board began filing back in. Tessa appeared at Mara's shoulder, not touching. Just present the way Tessa had been present for 20 years. Close enough to be reached, far enough to leave room. "They are ready," Tessa said. Mara turned back to the table. She picked up her folder. She straightened her jacket with the automatic small gesture of someone who has spent years making sure she looked composed before walking into rooms, and recognized the gesture, and did it anyway, because some habits are not bad habits. They are simply armor, and armor is not shameful. She sat down, and the room which had been holding its breath exhaled and began. 2 hours later, the board had voted on 4 resolutions. The restructuring plan was formally adopted. Independent financial oversight was established with a mandate and a budget. A formal governance review was commissioned from an outside firm, and Adrian Vale's executive authority was restructured to require co-leadership on all financial commitments above a defined threshold. A threshold that had been Mara's suggestion delivered through her consulting agreement, adopted without argument by every member of the board. The session closed at 12:43. Mara gathered her materials around her. People stood and stretched and reached for phones and began the rapid decompress that follows high-pressure meetings. Miles caught her eye across the table and nodded a small, tired, genuine nod that said everything it needed to. She was almost at the door when Sandra Park appeared beside her. Miss Ellison. She spoke quietly below the ambient noise of the room dispersing. Off the record, what you brought in this morning. Eleanor Vale's information about the appraisal firm. That is almost certainly going to be the thread that unravels whatever Robert Chu was doing and establishes the scope of the fraud. She paused. It also very cleanly establishes that you were not part of it. Mara looked at her. I wasn't part of it. I know, Sandra said. That's my point. The information you brought in established that beyond reasonable doubt. Information that you had every incentive to sit on if you'd wanted to protect yourself by letting the investigation move slowly. She held Mara's gaze. You chose to accelerate it instead. She paused, choosing her words, that's noted. Mara nodded once. She walked out. In the elevator going down, she was alone, and she let herself feel the full weight of the morning for exactly the 12 floors between the conference room and the lobby. The adrenaline leaving her system, the places where her back ached from tension she hadn't noticed holding. It's a specific exhaustion of someone who has spent 4 hours in a room where every sentence mattered and cannot now quite believe they are standing in an elevator going down. The lobby doors opened. She walked out into the midday Boston cold, and the air hit her face, sharp and clean and indifferent. And she stood on the sidewalk outside the building that had been the center of her professional life for 13 years. Then she took out her phone and called the first name on the list in her notebook. A woman named Carmen Reyes, who ran a small sustainable textile company in South Boston and had been trying for 2 years to get in front of the right investors, and who had no idea that the conversation she was about to have with Mara Ellison Vale was going to change the shape of the next decade of her life. The phone rang twice. Carmen answered. Hello, Carmen, Mara said. This is Mara Ellison. I am sorry to call without warning. Do you have 20 minutes? I have something I'd like to talk to you about. Pause. Then cautiously, of course. And Mara started walking through the noon crowd, through the cold, through the city that had watched her disappear and was now going to watch something else entirely. Talking to Carmen Reyes about what was possible and what was next, and what kind of door Mara was now in a position to open. And her voice was steady and warm and sure of itself, in the way it is when a person is finally fully speaking from the center of who they actually are, and not from the careful diminished edge of who someone else needed them to be. Behind her, the Vale Meridian building stood in its glass and steel certainty against a gray November sky. And inside it, a board meeting was wrapping up, and a fraud investigation was beginning, and a company was reorganizing itself around an absence that was also, in every meaningful sense, a foundation being honestly examined for the first time. Carmen Reyes turned out to be exactly the kind of person Mara had hoped she was. That conversation standing on a November sidewalk outside the Vale Meridian building, with cold air coming off the harbor and the noon crowd moving around her, lasted 43 minutes. Mara had said 20. Carmen had things to say that couldn't be said in 20. And Mara found herself stopping at a bench on the edge of Post Office Square, sitting down and actually listening. Not the kind of listening that is really waiting for your turn to speak, but the kind where you stop having your own thoughts for a while and just receive what someone else has built. Carmen's company made textiles from reclaimed fishing nets and ocean plastic. She had 11 employees. She had been profitable for 3 consecutive years. She had a purchase order from a regional hotel group that she couldn't fulfill because she didn't have the equipment financing to scale her production line, and she had been to 4 banks and 3 impact investors, and had been told in various polished languages that she was too small, too early, or too complicated. They kept telling me to come back when I was bigger, Carmen said. But I can't get bigger without the financing. So, Mara said. Yeah, how much do you need? A pause. The particular pause of someone who has been asked this question before and been made to feel bad about the answer. About $400,000 for the equipment and 6 months of operating buffer while production scales. $400,000 in the world. Mara had just spent the morning in a world of $47 million debt chains and $12 million collateral discrepancies. $400,000 was a rounding error. In Carmen Reyes's world, it was the difference between a company that survived and one that didn't. Send me your financials, Mara said, and the purchase order from the hotel group, and whatever you've already sent to banks and investors. I want to see how you've been presenting yourself. Another pause longer. Can I ask? Carmen started. What I am doing. Mara said. Yeah, building something. Mara said. That should have existed a long time ago. She looked up at the November sky. I'll call you by the end of the week. She hung up and sat on the bench for another few minutes, not thinking about the morning, not thinking about the board meeting or Robert Chu or the appraisal firm or any of it. Just sitting with the specific sensation of a conversation that had reminded her why she had gotten up this morning and why she would get up tomorrow. Then she stood, straightened her jacket, and walked into the rest of the afternoon. The Robert Chu investigation moved faster than anyone expected, which was either because Sandra Park's firm was genuinely excellent, or because Robert, faced with the convergence of Eleanor's information and the forensic document review, made a decision in consultation with his attorney that cooperation was less expensive than resistance. By Tuesday of the following week, the outlines of what he had done became clear enough to brief the board. He had selected the appraisal firm deliberately, not because he had a financial relationship with them. There was no kickback, no direct payment, nothing that simple. He had selected them because he had known from a prior transaction he'd handled before joining Vale Meridian that their valuations ran high. He had needed the Mercer Street collateral valued high enough to make the refinancing terms work, because the actual market value of the property would not have supported the loan structure Adrian wanted, and Adrian had wanted it. And Robert Chu had spent 8 years making things work that shouldn't have worked, because that was what kept him employed by a man who rewarded results and didn't examine methods. When Sandra Park presented this to the board, the room had the quality of air that has been held too long. He wasn't stealing, Sandra said. He wasn't enriching himself. Just solving a problem the only way he could see to solve it, using tools he knew were compromised in service of an executive culture that had made it clear the problems needed to be solved regardless of how. Gerald Fitch said, "Are you suggesting this is an institutional failure, not just an individual one?" "I am suggesting," Sandra said carefully, "that Robert Chu made choices that were wrong and potentially criminal, and that those choices were made inside a structure that had consistently rewarded making problems disappear over making them visible." She paused. Both things are true simultaneously. Adrian at the head of the table said nothing for a long moment. Then what's our exposure? Civil significant, criminal for Robert. It is possible the DA's office has been briefed. For the company dependent on the cooperation we demonstrate. She looked at the board, which has been substantial. Mara Ellison's early disclosure, the voluntary lender notification, the self-reporting, these are all factors that work in the company's favor. Mara was not in the room for this briefing. She had not been invited and she had not asked to be. Her consulting agreement had formally concluded the previous Thursday, executed cleanly and completely. The final document signed in Tessa's office, with a cup of coffee going cold on the desk between them. She knew about the briefing because Miles texted her afterward. Board meeting concluded. Outcome manageable. Sandra wants to formally thank you for the Eleanor connection. She said it made the difference. Mara read the text on her laptop in the Cambridge apartment, where she was reviewing Carmen Reyes's financials, which were genuinely good, better than Carmen had been able to communicate to the banks, which was its own kind of problem that Mara already knew how to fix. She typed back, glad. Take care of yourself, Miles. A minute later, you too. Good luck with what you're building. She set her phone down and went back to Carmen's numbers. The article kept moving after it ran. That was the thing Mara hadn't fully anticipated. She had expected a news cycle. She had underestimated what it felt like to a particular audience to read a particular story. The email started coming in on the Friday the article ran and didn't stop. Through the Commonwealth Business Review's contact form, through Lena Hart, through professional networks, through LinkedIn, through channels Mara didn't know she was reachable on. Women mostly, though not exclusively, who had read the article and recognized something in it with the specific recognition of their own experience. Women in finance, in law, in technology, in real estate, in medicine, in manufacturing, in agriculture. Women who had spent years or decades making things work that someone else took credit for, and had concluded before reading about Mara that this was simply the shape of professional life. Some of the emails were long, some were 3 sentences, some were barely coherent with the effort of saying something that had been unsaid for years. A retired CFO from Chicago wrote that she had guaranteed her husband's business debt for 19 years and had never been named in a single annual report. A woman running a food distribution company in Atlanta wrote that she had read the article to her team and 2 of the women had cried, not from sadness, she said, but from the shock of being seen accurately by something they'd read. Mara read every email. She didn't respond to all of them. There were too many, and she didn't have the infrastructure yet. But she read them, and she kept them in a folder she labeled "What This Is For." And on difficult days, she would open the folder and read a few, not for motivation exactly, but for orientation, to remember what the compass was pointing at. The Ellison Network's formal incorporation papers were filed on the 3rd week of November. Tessa had handled the structure, a nonprofit with a professional advisory arm that could generate revenue to sustain the charitable programming. The initial funding came from 3 sources. Mara's own assets from the divorce settlement, a founding contribution from Eleanor Vale's family office, and a program-related investment from the Philadelphia Foundation, whose director had called Mara within 48 hours of the article running, to say that they had been waiting for something like this, and were prepared to move quickly. 12 women were accepted into the first cohort. Mara had reviewed 67 applications in 2 weeks, most of them arriving through informal channels. Referrals from Lena Hart, from Carmen Reyes, from the network of relationships Mara had spent 15 years building, and that had, as she had always privately understood, never actually belonged to Adrian. They gathered for the first time in a rented conference room in Cambridge on a Tuesday morning in early December. And Mara stood at the head of the table and looked at them. 12 women of different ages and industries and backgrounds, all of whom had something real, and most of whom had been told in various ways that what they had wasn't quite enough, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter and more durable than pride. She felt like herself. "I am not going to tell you this is going to be easy," she said. "I am going to tell you that what you've built is real, and that the reasons you were told it wasn't enough are mostly about the room you were in and not about what you made." She paused. "We are building a different room." Someone at the table, a woman named Diane, who ran a biotech startup in Worcester, said, "What makes you think we can actually change the system, not just work around it?" Mara looked at her. "Because the system runs on relationships and capital, and we are building both, not working around directly into. We are not asking to be let in. We are becoming the door." Diane considered this. Then she nodded once, the nod of someone who is not easily convinced and has just been. The divorce was finalized in February. It was in the end surprisingly quiet. Adrian's attorney and Tessa had negotiated the terms over 6 weeks, in a process that Mara was largely not present for, which had been her preference. She did not want to sit across a table from Adrian in a room where lawyers were counting years and converting them to numbers. She trusted Tessa. She trusted that what she needed from the settlement was enough to launch the network securely and nothing more. And that was what Tessa got her. The terms were fair. More than fair, Tessa said. But Mara had stopped measuring against fairness in the abstract and was measuring against what was necessary, which was different. Adrian, in the final agreement, voluntarily added a clause that had not been part of the negotiation. A formal written acknowledgement appended to the settlement that documented Mara's contributions to Vale Meridian over 13 years and recognized their material impact on the company's financial stability. It had no legal force. It could not be enforced or litigated. It was simply a document that said in plain language, and with his signature at the bottom, what had actually happened and who had actually done what. Tessa brought it to Mara on a Thursday afternoon, sliding it across the table with the careful neutrality of a lawyer presenting a document whose emotional weight she understood and was not going to perform for. Mara read it. It was 4 paragraphs. It named specific transactions. It used the word essential in describing her role. It said in the 3rd paragraph that the public narrative of Vale Meridian's growth had been inaccurate in ways that were not accidental, and that Adrian Vale accepted responsibility for that inaccuracy. She set it down. He didn't have to do this, she said. No, Tessa said. Did he ask for anything in exchange? No. Tessa paused. His attorney told me it was his idea. He drafted it himself and asked them to include it. Another pause. For what it's worth, his attorney seemed a little surprised, too. Mara looked at the document. At his signature, the particular slant of it she'd seen on thousands of documents, the signature of a man she had known for 15 years, and was going to know in some reduced and honest form for whatever came after this. She felt something settle, not resolution. Life didn't resolve the way stories were supposed to, but something like the absence of an open wound. The difference between a thing that is still bleeding and a thing that has scabbed over badly and is going to leave a mark but is no longer bleeding. She encountered Sienna Cross in March. It was not a confrontation. That was the thing she wanted to note afterward. To herself, it was simply an encounter. The way cities produce encounters. 2 people whose stories had intersected, arriving at the same coffee counter at 7:40 in the morning. Sienna recognized her first. Mara saw the recognition arrive in her face, a slight stilling, a recalibration, and watched her decide in about 3 seconds not to look away. That took something. Mara acknowledged it internally. Mara, Sienna said. Sienna. They stood with their coffees, both ordered, neither moving toward the door. Sienna looked different from the ballroom, smaller, which was the thing that happened when you removed someone from their context. She was still striking. She also looked like a person who had spent several months processing something difficult, which Mara recognized because she knew what that looked like from the inside. I wanted to start it, then stopped. She tried again. He told me the marriage was finished. Those were the words he used. I want you to know I wasn't trying to. I know, Mara said, simply without invitation for more on the subject. Sienna looked at her. You are not angry at me. I was, Mara said honestly. Not as much as you might expect. The person who did the thing that night was him. You were also being told a version of things that suited him. She paused. That's not your fault. It's something to notice. Sienna was quiet. Her coffee cup had a ring on it from being held too long, the cardboard going soft. He told me I understood the future he was building, she said. I believed him because I wanted to. She looked down at her coffee. I have been thinking about that a lot. The wanting to. We all want to, Mara said. That's not weakness. It becomes weakness when the wanting to makes you stop looking clearly. She paused. You are looking clearly now, trying to. Mara picked up her coffee. She looked at Sienna, this woman who had been a focal point of one of the worst nights of her life, and who was also, she understood clearly, not the cause of anything, but a symptom of a problem that had existed long before the ballroom. Never let somebody else decide what you are worth, she said. Then she walked out. On the sidewalk, she didn't look back. Not from coldness, from completion. The conversation was complete. She carried no unfinished anger, no residue of the night that had started all of this. And the absence of it was not emptiness, but space. The specific space that opens up when you stop carrying something and realize how much of you was being used to hold it. The National Leadership Awards ceremony was in New York in late April. Mara flew down the morning of alone on a 7 a.m. flight that landed at LaGuardia in rain. She took a cab to the hotel, checked in, ate a room service breakfast she didn't particularly taste, sat at the small desk by the window, looking out at the wet city, thinking about the speech she had written and was not going to use. The speech was good. Tessa had read it and said it was exactly right, which meant it was correct and somewhat safe, which was not the same as true. Mara had written it 3 times over 2 weeks. Each draft a little more honest than the last until she had a version that was honest in the way that is organized for an audience. The honest with the rough edges sanded. The honest that flows from point to point without the messy recursive quality of what it actually feels like to have lived through something. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket at 5 o'clock, the ballroom of the hotel. It was a ballroom again. It was always a ballroom. The world seemed to do its significant things in ballrooms. It was high ceiling and warm, lit with the soft gold of an event that wanted to feel welcoming rather than institutional. 300 people roughly, tables of 8, a stage with a podium, a screen behind it. The particular sound of 300 people talking at moderate volume, which was a sound she had always found oddly comforting. The hum of humans in the same room trying to connect. She found her table and found Tessa, who had come down by train and looked as she always did at formal events, like someone who had achieved her actual self without assistance. Beside Tessa was Eleanor Vale, who had asked with characteristic directness whether she might attend, and whom Mara had said yes to without having to think about it. Eleanor was 71 and had the kind of bearing that came from decades of walking into rooms and deciding rather than being told whether she belonged. Beside Eleanor was Noah Mercer, who had called Mara in January to ask if there was any role for him in the Ellison network. Not because he deserved it, he said, but because he wanted to contribute something that corrected the imbalance of what he'd done. She had told him she'd think about it. She had thought about it. She had offered him a position on the network's governance committee, which was an unpaid role that required actual work, with no recognition attached to it, and he had accepted immediately. He was seated now with the uncertain posture of someone who is aware he is here on probation and intends to honor it, and at the far end of the table beside an empty chair that was waiting for Mara, her mother. June Ellison was 73 and had driven from Worcester with a neighbor because she didn't like flying and hadn't for 30 years. She was wearing the same blue dress she'd worn to Mara's college graduation, which still fit, and her hair was shorter than it had been, and her eyes, when she found Mara coming across the ballroom, were doing the thing they did when June was feeling something strongly and had decided not to hide it. Mara sat down beside her. June put her hand over Mara's on the tablecloth. No words, just that her mother's hand, warm and dry and familiar, the hand of a woman who had run a bookstore on principle for 20 years and had never once apologized for caring more about what things were worth than what they cost. "You look like yourself," June said finally. Mara looked at her. "I feel like myself." "Good," June said, and meant it the way only someone who had watched you be less than yourself for a long time can mean it. When they called her name, the room applauded in the way. Rooms applaud for people they genuinely respect, rather than people they are obligated to recognize. And Mara walked to the stage with the speech in her pocket and her mother's eyes on her back, and 13 years of everything trailing behind her like a coat she was no longer wearing, but hadn't yet set down. She reached the podium. She looked at the room. 300 faces turned toward her. The warmth of it, the genuine attention of 300 people who had chosen to be here, who had read about what the Ellison network was building and had decided it mattered. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the folded speech. Then she took her hand out empty. "I had a speech," she said into the microphone. "It was good. My attorney helped me with it." A small sound of laughter from the room. "I am not going to use it." She gripped the sides of the podium lightly, the way you hold something not for balance, but for the sensation of having something solid in your hands. "I spent 13 years becoming extraordinarily good at carrying things that other people needed carried," she said. "I was good at it. I want to be clear about that. I was genuinely good at it, and I am not going to pretend the skills I built during those years were worthless just because the context was wrong. The skills were real. They were mine. They went where I went when I left." She paused. What I didn't understand for a long time was the difference between being useful and being used. They feel almost identical from the inside. The difference is whether the person standing next to you receiving what you give is aware that they are receiving it. She paused again. Whether they say thank you, not publicly, not in a press release, in the way they speak about the work, in who gets credit in the room where the decision got made. She looked at the room. I spent 13 years in rooms where the credit went one direction and the work went another. And I told myself it didn't matter because the work was still getting done. The mistake wasn't the carrying. The mistake was believing that carrying things invisibly was the same as not mattering. The room was very still. The night I left, I put my wedding ring on a table and walked out of a ballroom. And I thought I was doing the most frightening thing I had ever done. She let that sit for a moment. But I wasn't. The most frightening thing I had ever done was earlier. It was every morning I woke up and decided to accept one more day of being erased because disrupting it felt too costly. She paused. That is the real courage question. Not can you walk out when things are bad enough, but can you name what's happening before you've talked yourself into surviving it? She looked at her table. Her mother, Tessa. Eleanor, upright and attentive with the expression of a woman, hearing something she wishes she had heard differently 30 years ago. Noah, looking at the tablecloth, which was honest of him. The Ellison Network exists because of what I learned, she said, not just from leaving, from everything before, from every lender relationship and negotiation, and 3 a.m. crisis management call and boardroom conversation where I was the most informed person in the room and the least credited one. All of that, every bit of it, is inside what we are building. The women in our first cohort are not benefiting from my suffering. They are benefiting from my competence. There is a distinction and it matters. She straightened slightly. What I want to say to the women in this room who are in the middle of something I recognize, not just in marriage, in any room where your work goes in one direction and your name goes another, is this. She paused. And let the pause be long enough to be real. What you know how to do does not belong to the context you learned it in. It belongs to you. When you leave, it leaves with you. Every relationship, every skill, every hard-won understanding of how things actually work, that is yours. Nobody can keep it when you go. She stopped. Walk out knowing that. The audience rose before she was done. Not all of them, but enough that it started a wave. And within 10 seconds, the sound was full and warm. And she stood at the podium absorbing it with the particular stillness of someone who is not performing gratitude, but genuinely feeling it. The plain, unadorned feeling of being in a room full of people who understood something and were saying so. She found her mother's face in the crowd. June was standing with the rest of them, her hands together, her eyes doing exactly what she decided not to hide. Mara held her gaze for a moment, then she stepped back from the podium. After the ceremony, in the quieter air of the hotel lobby, where people were dispersing into the New York night, Eleanor Vale found her. Not the boardroom Eleanor, not the careful, strategic Eleanor who had called at 6 in the morning with information about appraisal firms. This was something older. A woman in her 70s who had spent decades in rooms adjacent to power and was standing now with the specific posture of someone who has decided to put something down. I have something for you, Eleanor said. Not tonight, but I want you to know it's coming. Mara waited. The family office has relationships, Eleanor said. 5 decades of them. Donors, foundations, chairs of boards. The kind of access that gets built over 50 years of being in the right rooms and being consistent enough that people remember your name with warmth. She paused. I want to put those relationships in service of what you are doing. Not as a Vale family initiative. Not with my name on anything. Simply as a woman with connections who wants to see a specific thing exist in the world. Mara looked at her. The lobby moved around them. People saying goodbye. Cabs being summoned, the ordinary dispersal of an event concluding. Your terms, Mara said. Your terms, Eleanor said completely. She paused. I am not doing this to make amends to Adrian. I am not doing it to repair the family name. I am doing it because I have resources that could do something useful, and I've spent too many years applying them to things that mostly served appearance. She met Mara's eyes. I am 71. I'd like to spend whatever time is left on something that isn't that. Mara considered this. She had learned to take time with decisions that mattered, to resist the impulse to resolve discomfort by saying yes before she'd examined what she was agreeing to. She stood with it for a moment in the warm lobby air. Then, call me next week, she said. We'll start from the beginning and see what makes sense. Eleanor nodded once. That's all I am asking. She turned and walked toward the elevators, and Mara watched her go. This complicated woman who had made a convenient silence for years and was now trying in the only way available to her at 71 to do something with what she understood too late. People were capable of that. Mara was finding it was one of the things she needed to keep believing, not for sentimentality, but for accuracy. People could turn slowly, expensively, with cost to everyone involved, but they could. She flew back to Boston the next morning. The flight was early, 6:15, and the airport had the particular quality of airports at that hour where everyone is slightly outside of normal time, and the usual social performances are too expensive to maintain. She had a window seat, and she watched New York recede below her in the gray morning light, the city becoming abstract, the particular geography of ambition and density going flat and small. She opened her notebook, the same notebook she had started during the first weeks in the Cambridge apartment. Most of it was full now. Notes about the network, financial models, names of women she wanted to contact, frameworks for how the mentorship structure should work. The back pages were the ones she had written in when she was thinking rather than planning. And those pages had a different texture. She found the page with the sentence she had written in the first week. I still know exactly who I am. She read it. Then she turned to the last blank page. She wrote, Love is not measured by how much pain someone is willing to endure. It is measured by how much respect two people are willing to give. She looked at it for a moment. Then she wrote beneath it, I will never disappear inside someone else's success again. She looked at that too, at the two sentences together. The first was something she had arrived at over 13 years, the long, hard way. The second was something she had to choose every day going forward. Not dramatically, not in ballrooms, but in the ordinary recurring decision to take up space in her own life. She closed the notebook. Outside the window, the clouds had come in, and there was nothing to see but white in every direction, the particular nowhere of a plane between cities, between one version of a life and another. She had always found this moment on flights, the disappearance of geography, the suspension between, slightly vertiginous and also oddly clean. A few minutes where you were neither arriving nor departed, simply moving. She let herself be in it. She thought about Carmen Reyes, whose equipment financing had been secured 3 weeks ago through a combination of network connections and a direct introduction Mara had made to the Philadelphia Foundation's program officer. Carmen had called her the morning the money cleared and said nothing. For a moment, just breathed. And Mara had understood that breathing. She thought about the 11 other women in the first cohort, each of them carrying something real that had been called insufficient by rooms that were measuring wrong. She thought about Adrienne, who was by all accounts she was not actively seeking, but which reached her through Miles and Eleanor, in the neutral way of relevant updates, managing the restructured Vale Meridian with something that resembled genuine accountability. He had hired a new general counsel from outside the company, a woman with a reputation for transparency that was almost aggressive. He had restructured the executive team with a co-leadership model that required documentation of every significant decision. He had made, as far as she could tell from the outside, real changes, the kind that cost something, rather than the kind that looked good in press releases. She did not give him credit for this. He did not need her credit. That was the whole point. The whole long, expensive point of everything that had happened between October and April. He was becoming something without requiring her to be the reason. That was correct. That was in its way the closest thing to resolution the situation was capable of offering. She did not think about whether she still loved him. That question had become one of those questions that loses its shape if you press it too hard. She had loved him. She had loved the person he had been capable of being and had stopped choosing to be. She had loved a marriage that had been real before it became performance. Whether that love was past or simply changed into something without a useful name, she had stopped needing the answer. Some questions are real without being useful, and the skill was learning which ones to set down. The clouds broke. Boston appeared below the harbor first, that particular cold blue-gray, then the city fanning out from it. The specific density of a place that had shaped her and would go on shaping her, where she had done the most important work of her life largely without anyone knowing it, and where she was going to do the next important work with her name on it, in full view of anyone who wanted to look. The plane descended. The Cambridge headquarters, a proper office now, not a rented conference room. A suite on the third floor of a building that smelled like old brick and new ambition was alive by the time she arrived. 8 members of staff, 3 of them from the first network cohort who had joined in formal roles. The rest people Tessa and Mara had recruited over the winter. Phones, laptops, the working noise of people doing something they believed in, which had a specific quality, distinct from the noise of people doing something for a paycheck. And Mara could always tell the difference. She set her bag down at her desk, the desk she had chosen herself, positioned in the corner with the best natural light, beside the window that looked out over a small courtyard where someone had planted bulbs in October, and they were coming up now in the April warmth, small, green, insistent. On the wall across from her desk, in plain letters on the painted brick, was the name, the Ellison Network. She looked at it most mornings for the past 3 months. Today it looked slightly different, not in itself, but in what she brought to it. The award, the speech, her mother's face in the crowd, Eleanor's offer, Carmen's breathing silence on the phone when the money cleared. All of it accumulating into something that was not a conclusion, but a foundation. Real foundations don't conclude. They hold. Her assistant, a recent graduate named Priya, who had found the network through Lena Hart's article and applied for an administrative role with a cover letter Mara had read twice, knocked on the open door. "Good flight?" "Early," Mara said. "The Chicago call is at 10 o'clock, Priya said, and Carmen Reyes is confirmed for the Thursday cohort meeting." A pause. And there was a voicemail from someone named Diane Wu. She is an architect in Seattle. She said she read the article and she's been trying to build something for 2 years. And her bank told her last month she was. Priya checked her notes. Quote, "Impressive but premature." Mara looked up. "Get her number," she said. Priya nodded and went. The office sounds continued around her. Phones, conversations, the productive hum of a room full of people working on something that hadn't existed a year ago. She opened her laptop. She pulled up the Chicago expansion proposal, which she needed to review before the 10 o'clock call. She had a coffee on the desk, still hot, and the spring light was doing something specific to the brick walls, warming them, bringing out the red underneath the gray. And outside the window, the bulbs were coming up in the courtyard. And somewhere in Seattle, a woman named Diane Wu, who had been called premature by a bank, had left a voicemail that was about to change what she thought was possible. And Mara Ellison had 7 minutes before the workday began in full. She worked. Nobody in the building needed to introduce her. Nobody needed to explain who she was, or how she'd gotten here, or whose wife she had been. The name on the wall was hers, and the room was, and the work was hers entirely for the first time. And that was not a small thing to be. It was in fact the whole thing. She reached for her coffee. Outside, Boston moved through its April morning, indifferent and complete, and the bulbs in the courtyard came up in the sun, small and green, and entirely certain of themselves. And Mara Ellison opened the Chicago file and began.